Hey guys, tonight we're slipping behind the most forbidden doors of the Ottoman Empire, doors you were definitely not supposed to open unless your title was Sultan, or your job involved a scimitar and zero hesitation. We're heading straight into the lush, dangerous, rumour-drenched world of the Sultan's harem inside Topkapi Palace. Yes, that harem, the one whispered about in scandalous travellers' tales and painted with a lot more fantasy than fact. Spoiler, you probably won't survive this. Not because of swords or guards, though those are an issue, but because this place is a pressure cooker of power, envy, politics and secrets wrapped in silk. One wrong word, one misstep, and you're either vanished or mysteriously ill forever. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I mean, it's not like I'm going to lock you in a palace if you don't. Or will I? What city are you in tonight? And what time is it for you right now? Let me know in the comments. I love seeing where you're all watching from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing at the first courtyard of Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, but it's the late 1500s, and you're not a tourist with a camera and a half-eaten simit in your hand. You're disguised, slipping past soldiers in green silk robes and curled turbans. The air smells like spiced meat and candle wax, but also something colder. Power. You know you're getting close when the architecture changes. What had been open, ornate arches and open skies begins to close in. Doorways shrink. Guards narrow their eyes. You've reached the inner court. And then you see it. The golden gates. They're less about aesthetics, and more about absolute control. Etched with geometric patterns and Quranic verses, they shimmer faintly in the torchlight. This is the Gate of Felicity, ironically named, considering how many girls have cried behind it. Once you're in, you're not just entering the harem, you're stepping into a world that operates with its own gravity. Time slows, rules bend, and loyalty is everything. The word harem literally means forbidden or sacred, and both meanings apply. To outsiders, this space was a fantasy of hundreds of women lounging around waiting for the Sultan. To insiders, it was a high-stakes court of alliances, betrayals, and lethal ambition. The Sultan's harem was the size of a small village, often housing up to 300 women at a time, though the number varied wildly depending on the Sultan's preferences and political mood swings. You've got concubines, cooks, servants, tutors, entertainers, and a rotating cast of favourites. Oh, and one queen mother who could make or break you with a glance. Let's talk logistics for a second. The harem isn't one giant bedchamber, it's a maze. Over 400 rooms tucked behind thick walls and winding corridors. Marble floors stay cool even in the summer. Domed ceilings funnel the heat upward. Windows are few and high, filtering in dappled sunlight that never fully brightens the place. Privacy is engineered. So is surveillance. Every chamber has an echo. Every whisper could cost you. Now you're gliding past the courtyard of the black eunuchs. These men, castrated at a young age and brought from Africa, were the only males allowed within the harem. They weren't just guards, they were political players. We'll dive deeper into their story soon, but for now, just know that their eyes don't miss a thing. You pass a small fountain, its splash echoing against tiled walls. A group of young girls in gauzy kaftans scurry by, balancing trays of fruit and rosewater. They don't speak to you, but they glance sideways. Maybe you're new, or maybe you're already doomed. One fact that might surprise you. Not all harem girls were sex slaves. In fact, many were never touched by the Sultan. Some spent their entire lives as glorified courtiers, rising through the ranks based on intelligence, musical skill, or their ability to navigate palace politics without bleeding. A select few, however, would be chosen to serve the Sultan, and that's when things got complicated. But more on that later. Tonight, we're just exploring the bones of the place. You walk under archways tiled in Iznik blue and floral reds. The scent of oud and jasmine clings to the stone. Somewhere, someone is playing a ney flute, slow and breathy, like a lullaby wrapped in longing. A fringe fact for you. There was actually a protocol manual for the harem. Seriously, every movement, every word, even how to enter a room, it was all written down. You could get demoted for sitting in the wrong corner or addressing someone out of turn. Imagine living your entire life in a place where a mispronounced title, could get you reassigned to laundry duty, or worse. At the centre of the harem is the Sultan's private suite. It's lavish but not excessive. Lots of deep cushions, gold-threaded curtains, and bookshelves that whisper of Persia and Andalusia. The Sultan himself often used this area not just for sleeping, but for reading poetry, sipping thick Turkish coffee, and, yes, plotting with his mother or favourite consort about how to handle rebellious provinces. Scholars still debate just how much political influence these women actually had. Some say the Sultan rarely consulted them, that their power was symbolic. Others argue the opposite, that consorts and especially the Queen Mother orchestrated major decisions including wars, marriages and executions. The truth? Probably somewhere in the middle, swaddled in plausible deniability and silk. And here's something even more deliciously twisted. The harem was technically part of the Imperial household, not the government. That meant everything that happened inside, every plot, punishment or power play, was personal, not political. But when you're an emperor whose moods can determine foreign policy, that line blurs fast. As you continue through the polished corridors, you start to notice something else. Silence. Not the absence of noise exactly, but the presence of watchfulness. Every whisper is measured, every step is felt. This place isn't just beautiful, it's calculated. It's a stage built for survival. Outside, the world may think the Sultan's harem is just a gilded prison, but inside you begin to sense the truth. It's a kingdom, and every woman in here is playing a game. Tomorrow, we'll meet the ones who guard this kingdom, the eunuchs. And let's just say, they're not what you expect. So here you are, standing at the edge of power, and what's stopping you from entering the most restricted chambers of the harem? Not a locked door, not a wall of armed soldiers, not even the wrath of the Sultan himself. Number. It's a man in silk robes with a blank stare and a voice as calm as midnight. He's one of the black eunuchs, and he's been watching you since you stepped through the gate of felicity. You didn't even notice. That's how good he is. Let's clear up a misconception before we go any further. Eunuchs weren't simply unfortunate souls robbed of their anatomy and thrown into a life of servitude. In the Ottoman court, especially the harem, being a eunuch meant wielding immense quiet power. You weren't just a servant, you were the wall between the Sultan's most intimate realm and the rest of the empire. And if you played your cards right, you could climb the ranks to become Kızlar Ağası, the chief black eunuch, arguably one of the most powerful figures in the entire Ottoman hierarchy. Picture him now, tall, dark-robed, possibly from Sudan or Ethiopia, his voice low but absolute. He doesn't need to shout. His authority isn't in volume, it's in presence. You step to the side without thinking. Everyone does. He walks by like a ghost who knows exactly when you'll die. Historically, the Ottomans preferred African eunuchs for the harem because of a belief, utterly wrong but deeply rooted, that they were more loyal and less likely to form family attachments. Castrated at a young age, these boys were trafficked across the Red Sea or through Egypt, sold into slavery, and handed over to Ottoman officials who trained them for life in the palace. By the time they reached Topkapi, they had one job: guard the women, all of them. But guarding doesn't just mean standing outside a door with a curved scimitar. The black eunuchs were administrators, messengers, and intelligence officers. They arranged meetings, delivered correspondence between the Sultan and the women, supervised punishments, and sometimes, especially when the politics got bloody, executed silent orders. If the Queen Mother wanted a rival punished, she whispered to the Kızlar Ağası. If a concubine tried to flee, or send a secret letter, the eunuchs found out and she was never seen again. Fringe fact, the chief black eunuch had access to the royal seal. Yeah, that one. He could sign off on imperial orders on behalf of the Sultan. If that's not trust, I don't know what is. You could argue he had more practical power than the Grand Vizier. He also had private apartments inside the harem, a privilege that no other man, not even the Sultan's brothers, could claim. Imagine that. You're the only male allowed to live full-time inside the Sultan's forbidden garden. Now let's say you're a low-ranking eunuch just starting your tenure. You don't sleep much. You're expected to anticipate every move of the women, know every name and title, monitor alliances, and never show bias. Oh, and you're supposed to do it all while looking completely invisible. You're not there to be seen. You're there to know everything. A scholar's open question. Were the eunuchs loyal to the Sultan or to the Queen Mother? It's a slippery thing to define. The Valide Sultan controlled the harem, and thus the eunuchs who guarded it. But they were also technically in service to the Sultan himself. In practice, it seems they bent toward whoever had the upper hand at the time, and when the balance of power shifted, as it often did, the eunuchs pivoted with it, like well-trained shadows. You're moving deeper now, through a narrower passage lit by wall sconces. You hear voices, high-pitched, feminine, but not relaxed. There's tension. Someone's crying softly. The eunuch ahead of you stops, listens, then moves on without a word. Whatever happened in that room isn't his concern. Or maybe it is, and he's just waiting for someone to tell him what to do about it. Either way, you get the feeling that nothing escapes him. The walls are tiled in dark blues and rich greens, with gold filigree curling around Arabic script. You pass a calligraphed panel quoting the Quran, likely chosen by the Valide Sultan herself. This isn't just decoration, it's moral camouflage. A reminder that this world, though cloaked in power games and whispered threats, still wears the face of religious piety. Let's swing back to the hierarchy of eunuchs for a second. Below the chief black eunuch were several ranks of subordinates, from senior aides to basic chamber guards. Each had a specialty. Some handled food, others letters, others physical security. And even among eunuchs, there was rivalry. Promotions were possible, but not common. Sabotage wasn't rare. After all, you're working in the harem. If the women don't kill each other, someone's going to. And yes, before you ask, there are records of eunuchs being poisoned, framed, or quietly retired when their usefulness ran out. But there are also stories of incredible resilience. Some of these men spent 40, even 50 years serving in the harem, becoming legends in their own right. Some even built mosques or schools with the wealth they accumulated, leaving behind architectural footprints far beyond the palace walls. You enter a courtyard now, small and secluded. It's used for air and sunlight, but always under watch. There's a pomegranate tree at the centre, its fruit just beginning to split open under the summer heat. A pair of eunuchs stands at opposite ends of the courtyard, back straight, eyes scanning. The message is clear. Nothing happens here without permission. Occasionally, the eunuchs served another, far stranger purpose. They acted as living symbols of paradox. Neither fully men nor entirely outsiders, they became the ultimate neutral force, a presence you couldn't seduce, couldn't bribe with family loyalty or bloodline politics. And yet, in the hands of the Valide Sultan, they became instruments of terrifying precision. You can't help but wonder what they thought of the women. Did they envy them? Pity them? Fear them? Or maybe they simply regarded them as moving parts in a vast living machine. After all, the eunuchs weren't there to form attachments. They were there to control the system and survive it. As you leave the courtyard, the sun dips behind the domes of Topkapi, casting long shadows across the stone. The harem is entering its quiet phase. Soon, lamps will be lit, meals delivered, and bodies will disappear into private chambers. And the eunuchs? They'll still be watching. Always watching. Next time we'll get lost in the maze of rank and protocol that define the harem's internal caste system. Because even paradise has a pecking order. You can hear it before you see it. Soft voices layered with laughter, the faint tinkle of jewellery, the swish of slippers on stone. You're being led now into the very heart of the harem, the women's quarters. But before you start imagining incense clouds and seductive dances, let's be clear. This place runs on hierarchy, not hormones. Every room, every glance, every breath here is shaped by rank. And yours doesn't exist. You're a ghost tonight, slipping between realities. Behind one screen, girls are arranging embroidery silks. Behind another, a tutor is drilling a group of concubines on Persian poetry. There's not a single moment in this place without purpose. Because here, status isn't given. It's clawed for. So who's at the top of the pyramid? No, not the Sultan. Inside this world, the most powerful woman isn't necessarily the most beautiful or beloved. It's the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother. She's the matriarch of the harem, the only woman who can command the eunuchs, approve consort promotions, and even sway imperial policy. More on her soon. But beneath her, you'll find a whole ladder of titles and dangers. Let's break it down. At the very bottom are the Asimi Kızlar, the novice girls. These are the youngest arrivals, often aged 7 to 10, plucked from across the empire. Some came from Christian families in Eastern Europe, others from the Caucasus or even Circassian highlands. Some were given up willingly, believing their daughters would rise in rank and live in luxury. Others, taken, plain and simple. These girls spend their early years cleaning, learning Turkish, studying Islam, and practicing palace etiquette down to the angle of a bow. If they're bright, obedient and pretty, they graduate into the next tier, cariye, or concubines in training. This is where the real game begins. As a cariye, your life becomes performance art. You're trained in everything from playing the Audi to applying coal in a way that suggests effortless allure. You learn to dance, sing, recite scripture, pour coffee gracefully, and, yes, how to speak with both humility and strategic charm. Your ultimate goal? To be chosen. But let's pause here. Being chosen by the Sultan isn't romantic. It's a political shift. The moment a concubine is summoned to his chamber, her fate is sealed. Either she becomes a favourite or she disappears back into obscurity. If she bears a son, everything changes. A girl who gives birth to a male heir becomes Iqbal, a favourite. Bear another son and you're promoted to Kadin, a title translating roughly to wife, though there was no formal marriage. Only one woman, though, becomes Haseki Sultan. That title is reserved for the Sultan's top favourite, his main consort. She commands wealth, staff, and immense influence. But it's a sharp cliff to fall from. Hasekis have been poisoned, banished, or quietly retired when they grew too confident. And hovering above all of this, like a silk-draped sun, the Valide Sultan. Even the Sultan bows to her in certain contexts. She rules the harem like a CEO with a dagger behind her smile. No major decision passes without her approval. She decides who eats what, who gets punished, and which rival gets transferred to another palace. She's political, lethal, and often underestimated by foreign observers who imagined her as just another royal grandmother. Big mistake. Here's your quirky little fringe fact. There were official ranking ceremonies in the harem. Think of them as awkward medieval office parties, but with more eyeliner and possibly some sabotage. Women were promoted publicly, their new titles read aloud, their status cemented by new chambers, richer fabrics, or better food rations. Meanwhile, others quietly packed their things and moved down the hall, demoted and forgotten. You pass through a corridor now, where the tiles shift from pale blue to deep crimson. This is the zone for higher-ranking concubines. The light is warmer here, the cushions plumper, the air tinged with rosewater and something else. Ambition. You see a young woman draped across a chaise, being fanned lazily while a eunuch delivers a folded note. She doesn't look up. She knows her place, and more importantly, she knows yours. A scholar's debate worth noting. Did these women genuinely crave the Sultan's affection, or was it all a survival strategy? Some historians argue that real emotional bonds developed, even love stories that rival Shakespearean drama. Others insist that everything, from smiles to pregnancies, was calculated. After all, motherhood here wasn't just maternal, it was strategic. A son meant property, power, a future. A daughter, not so much. You duck through another room and see 3 women practicing music, their fingers plucking at strings while a tutor corrects their posture. There's elegance here, yes, but also discipline. If you hit the wrong note in more ways than one, your future disappears. It's easy to imagine these women as passive figures, but they were anything but. Behind the veils and the poetry, they were negotiating their own survival, forming alliances, sabotaging rivals, earning favours from eunuchs, sending coded messages, even picking out subtle gifts to curry favour with the Valide Sultan. Every interaction was a move on the chessboard. Let's not ignore the darker corners either. Some concubines spent decades here, never chosen, never freed. Their days were a repetitive cycle of prayers, chores, and unspoken dreams. After 20 years, some were granted manumission and allowed to marry, but many preferred to stay. Life outside was risky. Inside, at least they knew the rules. You arrive at a small alcove overlooking the palace gardens. A few Kadins sit together, sipping sherbet, murmuring to one another in soft tones. You don't need to hear the words to know what's being discussed. Rank changes, romantic rumours. Who got summoned last night? Who didn't? And yes, you're right to guess that every promotion came with enemies. As one woman rose, others plotted. Poisoned pastries, cursed amulets, or even a spilled rumour could be the end of someone's climb. The harem was both school and battlefield. At the very top it's lonely. Even the Valide Sultan, with her army of eunuchs and chambers of gold, must sleep lightly. One wrong move from her son, one new favourite with ambition, and the empire she's built could turn against her. But for now she rules this world like a queen within a queen's court. And just when you think you understand how it works, someone gets summoned. Next time, we're following that call. The royal bedchamber awaits. And what happens there isn't just personal. It's empire-altering. The summons arrives like a ripple through still water. A eunuch glides silently across polished marble, his hands folded, his gaze never meeting another's. He leans in to whisper to one of the senior Cadins, and then, barely perceptible, her eyes shift toward a girl sitting at the edge of the chamber, combing her hair. That girl is the chosen one tonight. No fanfare, no drum roll, just a slight lift of the chin, and her entire life changes. This is how it begins. When the Sultan wishes for company, he doesn't make his desires known publicly. Discretion is everything. The chosen concubine is notified, quietly, often just after sunset, and she has only a few hours to prepare. It's a ritual, and she knows it by heart. She sets aside the silk she was stitching. She bows silently. Then she vanishes behind an embroidered curtain with her attendants trailing behind. If you're imagining perfume baths and seductive dance training, well, you're not entirely wrong, but it's more clinical than sensual. First comes the cleansing, an elaborate bath in the hammam, the palace's steamy domed bathhouse tiled in gold and aquamarine. She's scrubbed, oiled, plucked, and scented by a team of women whose sole job is to make her flawless. Her hair is coiled into waves, dark eyes outlined with kohl, lips tinted with crushed pomegranate. It's not seduction, it's ceremony. You follow, unnoticed, as she's dressed in gauzy layers, nothing too heavy, everything designed to be slipped off easily. Around her neck, a delicate chain with a charm the Valide Sultan once gave her for good behaviour. It might bring luck, or protection, or nothing at all. Then she's wrapped in a velvet shawl and handed off to a eunuch. He'll escort her through the dim corridors to the Sultan's private suite, known simply as the Hazoda, the sacred chamber. This isn't just a bedroom, it's the gravitational centre of the empire. Behind its carved doors, sultans have whispered treaties, conceived heirs, and made decisions that sent armies marching across continents. The room is enormous but cloistered, low lighting, rich textures, and silence so deep you can hear the blood in your ears. There's a fountain trickling in the corner, not for decoration, but to mask conversations from listening ears. Even the walls here are suspect. So what really happens in there? That's where things get fuzzy, even among historians. Some sources suggest the Sultan might not even speak to the girl. He might nod, gesture, or remain in silence. Others tell of gentle conversation, poetry, sometimes even music before intimacy. The Sultan, after all, was expected to be cultured, educated, a man of letters as well as swords. There's an old harem saying, "The Sultan doesn't choose the girl, the empire chooses her," because this night, it could make or break her. If she's forgettable, she returns to her room and continues her quiet life among the other cariyes. But if she impresses him, or if she conceives a child, everything shifts. She becomes Iqbal, a favourite, one step closer to power, or at least to safety. Fringe fact time. The Sultan never saw the same woman 2 nights in a row unless she was a favourite. There was a rotating schedule, almost like a secret calendar that only the Valide Sultan and her senior eunuchs understood. It prevented obsession, jealousy, and undue influence, at least in theory. Of course, some women did capture the Sultan's heart, and those stories are where things start to heat up historically. Let's not forget how loaded the stakes were. Bearing the Sultan a son could be a blessing, or a death sentence. Each son became a prince, yes, but in the Ottoman world, princes were political threats to one another. Brothers didn't just compete, they sometimes killed each other for the throne. So when a girl stepped into the Sultan's chamber, she wasn't just hoping for pleasure. She was potentially walking into a bloodline war. You can feel the weight of it as she kneels at the edge of the Sultan's divan, eyes lowered, trained not to speak unless spoken to. The Sultan might lift her chin, he might whisper a verse, or he might already be watching her, testing her poise. The art here isn't just in beauty, it's in reading him. in giving just enough and never too much. Even in bed, the harem was a chessboard. A heated scholarly debate still exists about how much autonomy these women had. Was their participation coerced? Were they enthusiastic, or were they resigned? Some modern historians argue that they exercised significant control in these moments, that the women were well versed in political timing and knew how to tilt the odds in their favour. Others point out that being summoned wasn't optional. Once your name was called, refusal was unthinkable. So where does empowerment end and survival begin? Outside the chamber, the eunuch waits. No eye contact, no movement. He's a statue of patience, aware that inside history might be taking root. He'll escort the girl back to her chambers afterward, and sometimes, if she pleases the Sultan, she'll receive new jewellery, better food, or a discreet note from the Valide Sultan offering congratulations. But sometimes there's nothing. No reward, no acknowledgement, just silence. Back in the concubine quarters, the other women pretend not to notice when she returns. No one asks questions. They don't need to. Her face says it all. And if her bedding is quietly removed and laundered by special attendants the next morning, well, that's a clue. The palace keeps quiet records of menstrual cycles and conception. Midwives and herbalists begin monitoring her. She doesn't even know it yet, but her body's being tracked like a political campaign. And if she conceives, oh darling, that's a new chapter entirely. But we'll get there. For now, you can't help but think of the girl as she sits alone in her bedchamber, the perfume still clinging to her hair, the echo of the Sultan's voice, if he spoke at all, repeating like a ghost. What happens next is up to fate, and fate in the harem is as unpredictable as the Sultan's mood after his morning coffee. Outside, the domes of Topkapi gleam under moonlight. A new day is coming, and with it, new power games. The girl may have climbed a rung, or she may already be forgotten. That's the cruelty of it all. Next, we pull back the curtain on the real centre of power here, the Valide Sultan. If you think the Sultan rules the empire alone, think again. You wake to the soft shuffle of slippers outside the chamber and the smell of rosewater clinging to the damp stone walls. Somewhere, bells chime for morning prayer, and already the harem is stirring. But today isn't like other days. You're about to meet the true power behind the veil, the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, and the quiet architect of everything that happens behind these walls. If the Sultan is the sun, then she's the moon, cool, distant, and capable of pulling oceans. Her name changes with each generation, but her role never does. She is the Valide Sultan, the mother of the ruler, the only woman in the Ottoman Empire officially allowed to interfere in imperial politics. Everyone in this palace, from eunuchs to concubines to ministers, knows her power is not symbolic, it's real, and sometimes it's terrifying. Her quarters lie deeper in the harem complex, past a lattice of private chambers and secluded courtyards. Hers is not the biggest room, nor the most extravagantly decorated, but the weight of it is unmistakable. The walls are etched with verses in delicate calligraphy, the cushions deep crimson velvet, the scent a mix of sandalwood and something subtler, maybe frankincense, maybe power itself. A eunuch bows before sliding aside the curtain, and there she sits, surrounded by silence so thick it feels sacred. She doesn't need to speak when you enter. Her eyes, lined with age but sharp as obsidian, scan you with a calculation honed over decades. You're a fly, or maybe a useful tool. Either way, she sees your entire life before you've taken 2 steps. You might expect warmth from a mother, but the Valide Sultan isn't here to nurture, she's here to control, and she does it brilliantly. No one rises in the harem without her approval. If you're promoted, it's because she allowed it. If you're summoned by the Sultan, chances are she had a hand in the timing. You don't just serve her son, you serve her legacy. What's especially remarkable is how she got here. Once, she too was a concubine. She entered this place as a girl, unknown and probably terrified. She learned the system, mastered the arts, survived the rivalries, and did the unthinkable. Bore the Sultan who would survive all the others. That's the golden ticket. A son who lives long enough to become ruler means you become Valide. Everyone else? Just history. It's a strange promotion, though. Once her son ascends the throne, she's not just elevated, she's moved. Literally. She leaves the harem where she spent her youth and is transferred to the Sultan's court with her own staff, eunuchs, and apartments. but her influence extends backward too. She still governs the harem itself, appoints senior women, and oversees the entire educational structure. It's like being promoted to CEO and still micromanaging your old department. Except your department is a labyrinth of political rivals who wear silk and sleep with your son. One of the most dangerous parts of her job? Managing the Sultan himself. He might be the absolute ruler of the Ottoman Empire, but that doesn't mean he always makes good decisions. The Valide Sultan is expected to advise him, but subtly. She can't scold or contradict him in public. Instead, she uses her eunuchs, her allies in the harem, and sometimes just a carefully worded poem left on his breakfast tray to nudge him in the right direction. Fringe fact, in some eras the Valide Sultan even held diplomatic correspondence with foreign monarchs. That's right, kings and queens from Europe wrote her letters. Some sent gifts, others asked favours. There are rumours that one Valide Sultan even advised the Sultan to delay going to war so that a diplomatic envoy from Venice could arrive. She didn't just rule the harem, she shaped world politics in her spare time, but her role isn't always so glamorous. When rival concubines rise too fast or when her influence is threatened, the Valide Sultan can, and often does, respond with ruthless efficiency. She's known to have arranged emotions, punishments, and mysterious illnesses. If you've seen the same concubine twice, and then never again, there's a good chance the Valide was behind her vanishing act. A question still debated by historians. Did the Valide Sultan genuinely believe in the ideals of the empire, or was it all about preserving her own power? Some scholars paint her as the stabilizing hand behind volatile rulers, a true patriot, even if her methods were brutal. Others argue she simply played the game better than anyone else, and in a world built on manipulation, her actions were about survival, not devotion. You leave her chamber in a daze. It's not just the weight of her gaze or the quiet confidence of her voice. It's the realization that nothing here happens by accident. The poisoned peach on a tray, the unexpected promotion, the concubine suddenly favoured after months in obscurity. It's all choreography, and she's the one calling the tune. You pass a group of young girls seated in a circle, practicing court poetry. They smile and bow as you walk by, unaware, or maybe very aware, that they too might one day serve her, or be eliminated by her. It depends on who they impress, or who they threaten. It's worth noting that not all Valide Sultans were cruel. Some were known for building schools, hospitals, mosques. One used her fortune to construct a water system for the poor of Istanbul. Another opened a soup kitchen for widows. But even these acts were political, because generosity, in the hands of a Valide, was never just about kindness. It was about legacy, influence, eternal reputation. Night begins to fall again over Topkapi, and from your window the Bosphorus stretches like a dark ribbon below. The Sultan may lie in his chamber with tonight's chosen woman, but above him, always above him, is the woman who once cradled him, trained him, and now quietly rules his empire. Next, we step into the shoes of a woman who managed the impossible, becoming the Sultan's favourite. Not just for one night, but for years. It starts with a glance, not the longing, slow-motion cinema kind, more like a flash of recognition across a crowded courtyard. The Sultan notices her. Among a sea of silks and painted smiles, she stands out. Maybe it's the way she pours sherbet with unfussy grace, or the way she speaks without trying to charm him. Maybe she recites a verse of poetry that hits him somewhere he didn't know existed. Whatever the reason tonight, he doesn't just summon her, he remembers her. This is how a woman begins the journey to becoming the Haseki Sultan, the Sultan's official favourite, and sometimes the love of his life. Not just a warm body for one night, but a fixture in his world, a companion, a power broker, maybe even a queen in everything but title. But don't let the word favourite fool you into thinking this is all candlelit bliss and romantic strolls through the garden. The path to Haseki is paved with danger, because in the Ottoman Empire, love is not just an emotion, it's a threat. The moment a woman captures the Sultan's heart, she captures his attention, and that means everyone else, eunuchs, ministers, rivals, starts watching her like a snake under glass. Our example tonight? Harem. If you've heard of any woman from the Ottoman harem, it's probably her. Born as Roxolana, possibly in what is now Ukraine, she entered the harem as a slave in the early 1500s. She should have vanished into obscurity like thousands of others, but she didn't. She smiled, told jokes, sang songs, and within months Sultan Suleiman couldn't stop thinking about her. He kept summoning her, and eventually he did the unthinkable. He fell in love. Now here's the catch. Ottoman sultans weren't supposed to marry. Seriously. It was an unwritten rule for centuries. Concubines could bear sons, but wives. That implied equality. And the sultan didn't share power with anyone. But with Harem, Suleiman broke all the rules. He freed her, then married her. Publicly. The empire gasped, the harem roared, and the Valide Sultan reportedly needed smelling salts. Once Harem became Haseki, her life changed dramatically. She was moved into her own apartments, lavish, guarded, and separate from the concubines. Her status was now so high that eunuchs bowed before her, and even the viziers, the elite bureaucrats of the empire, treated her words with caution. And yes, she had her own staff, her own income, her own network of spies. She was no longer just a favourite. She was a force. Fringe fact. Harem maintained a regular correspondence with Suleiman when he travelled for military campaigns. She wrote letters, some preserved to this day, filled with affection, advice, even subtle critiques of his political choices. Imagine being a 16th century emperor, and your girlfriend is basically editing your policy decisions from the bathhouse. But don't think it was all soft-spoken influence. Harem had enemies, and she played hard. She manoeuvred the exile of a rival concubine, possibly orchestrated the downfall of the Grand Vizier, who happened to be her husband's best friend, and positioned her sons in a line of succession that ended with one of them on the throne. If you're getting Lady Macbeth vibes, you're not wrong. Only Harem didn't go mad. She got a mosque built in her name. Historians still argue whether she was a manipulative viper, or a clever survivor playing a cruel game with the only tools she had. Some say her love for Suleiman was genuine. Others think she saw him as a path to ultimate security and acted accordingly. The truth, as always, lies somewhere between desire and strategy. But no one disputes that she changed the empire, and she wasn't the only one. The title of Haseki Sultan became semi-official in the centuries that followed, a sort of first lady of the harem. Each new Haseki played the game differently. Some leaned into art and charity, others into politics and vengeance, but all of them walked a tightrope. The moment the Sultan's eye wandered, their power could vanish. The daily life of a Haseki was a performance of balance. She had to remain alluring but not manipulative, wise but not overbearing, devoted to the Sultan's happiness while still advocating for her own children. Because once she had sons, everything got more complicated. Now she wasn't just the Sultan's favourite, she was the mother of a potential heir, and that put a target on her back. Every other concubine with a son now considered her an obstacle. The Valide Sultan, depending on the political climate, might see her as an ally or a rival. And the eunuchs? They watched her every move, ready to report back to whichever camp benefited most from her rise or her fall. It's a wonder these women didn't develop permanent neck tension from constantly looking over their shoulders. A common myth is that the Haseki lived a life of pampered leisure, but in truth she was more CEO than queen. She supervised dozens of attendants, managed her own budget, advised on matters of religion, and coordinated with the Valide Sultan on harem governance. Her influence could extend to architecture, commissioning buildings, endowments, even whole neighbourhoods. Imagine a concubine funding an orphanage that still exists today. That's legacy. And yes, she wielded real diplomatic power. Ambassadors often sent her gifts, hoping to gain favour with the Sultan through her. Sometimes it worked. Other times, it just landed the poor diplomat on the next boat home. One ongoing scholarly debate centres on whether the rise of the Haseki Sultan contributed to the empire's political instability. Some argue that empowering women in the palace blurred lines of authority and sparked factionalism. Others say these women were stabilisers, often reining in impulsive sultans and providing continuity. Behind the curtain. Again, the truth probably sits on a cushion somewhere between those two poles. As the lamps are lit in the palace once more, and a new concubine is summoned down the winding corridor, the Haseki watches from her window. Her son is growing. Her influence stretches like shadowed silk across the palace. She knows the Valide Sultan is aging. She knows the Sultan trusts her more than most. And she knows that, in the harem, being beloved is the beginning of power, but not the endgame. That comes when your child puts on the crown. Next, we enter the chamber where whispers become war plans. the pillow talk politics that shaped the fate of an empire. You'd think the empire was governed from the Imperial Council, that grand chamber where robed viziers debated over scrolls, where maps were unrolled and stamps thudded onto decrees. But no, sometimes the real power play happened in a far more intimate setting, on the edge of a gilded mattress with incense curling toward the ceiling, and a sultan half-dressed, leaning in to hear a voice softer than a breath but sharper than a dagger. Welcome to pillow politics. The harem wasn't just about beauty and obedience. It was a fully functional engine of influence, and the most elite women knew exactly how to steer it. The Haseki Sultan, the Valide Sultan, even high-ranking Kadins, they didn't simply exist for pleasure. They used the access they had to speak directly into the ears of the most powerful man in the empire. And the Sultan, he wasn't immune to the intimacy of those hours. Something about the quiet after midnight, the perfume, the warm body beside him, it made him listen. And sometimes act. So how does a conversation in a bedchamber change the fate of nations? Easy. Start small. A whispered mention that a certain vizier has been cruel to the Janissaries. A casual question about whether the tribute from Egypt has arrived yet. A subtle suggestion that maybe, just maybe, it's time to consider giving your son a governorship. The words aren't commands, they're thoughts, observations. But the next morning those thoughts become policies. Someone gets reassigned. A ship is rerouted, a name gets crossed out of the guest list, and sometimes out of history. It wasn't always the Haseki pulling these strings. The Valide Sultan often used her influence too, though usually through intermediaries. Her methods were subtler, more ceremonial. She might recommend a scholar to tutor the princes, or suggest a change in the Sultan's inner circle. But the Haseki had proximity, and proximity in politics is a weapon. Fringe fact for you. There are records of entire military campaigns being influenced by pillow talk. In one case, a sultan delayed marching to war for a month because his favourite was pregnant and afraid to be left behind. In another, a concubine convinced him to grant mercy to a rival prince, which unfortunately led to a brief civil war. Romantic? Not really, but deeply consequential. The women of the harem weren't allowed to hold office, but they understood court dynamics better than most statesmen. They read between the lines of correspondence, kept mental notes of which vizier bowed too low, which ambassador brought the best gifts. They understood that emotion could sway judgment, and in the dim hours of the night they wielded emotion like seasoned generals wield swords. You're following one such scene now, invisible in the shadows of the Hazoda. The Sultan reclines on an embroidered divan, a glass of sherbet in his hand, his Haseki curled beside him. She's laughing softly at something he said, but then, ever so gently, she pivots. "That Georgian girl," she says, tracing her finger along the rim of her glass. "The one with the quick tongue. She's clever. Too clever." The Sultan frowns, not angry, just thinking. "You think she's dangerous?" he asks. The Haseki doesn't answer right away. She places her hand on his arm and looks away, as if the thought pains her. "I think she could distract you. It's not a threat. It's a gift-wrapped warning. Tomorrow, the Georgian girl will be reassigned to a different palace. No explanation, no fuss. Another layer to this quiet manipulation. The sons. Every woman in the harem with a son is thinking 10 moves ahead. Because sons don't just secure a woman's rank. They're tickets to future power. A prince who becomes sultan will elevate his mother to Valide Sultan. It's the ultimate promotion. So bedtime talks often include discussions about children, where they'll be educated, which provinces they'll govern, which tutors they'll be assigned. Every suggestion has an agenda, a debated point among scholars. Did the sultans know they were being manipulated? Some say absolutely. They were seasoned rulers, not love-struck idiots. They allowed the women to influence them because they trusted them. Others argue that the intimacy made them vulnerable, that no matter how strategic a man thinks he is, he's still flesh and blood in the dark. But the women didn't just shape decisions through talk, they shaped reputations. Rumours in the harem moved like smoke. If a woman wanted to damage a vizier or a rival, she could spread a whisper that reached the sultan's ears by breakfast, and once something reached the sultan's ears, it might as well be inscribed on stone. Perception was reality. You pass a cluster of eunuchs in the corridor, their hands full of letters and trays. They are the lifeline between the harem and the outer court, And they know who's rising and who's falling by how many notes they carry and to whom. The Grand Vizier may think he's in charge, but if the Valide Sultan cuts off his messages or the Haseki badmouths him during dessert, his days are numbered. Even foreign affairs weren't safe from these bedroom negotiations. European ambassadors sent spies to gather intel on the harem. Some even tried to bribe concubines through back channels. There are tales, some true, some not, of letters from Venice or France making their way into the Sultan's bedchamber, hidden inside gifts meant for his favourite. The harem was supposed to be sealed from the outside world. In truth, it was the nerve centre. You step out into the private gardens now, walking past moonlit trees and stone fountains. A figure sits alone on a bench. It's the Haseki, wrapped in a fur-lined robe, sipping tea. She's quiet, but you can feel the calculation in her stillness. Tomorrow she'll advise the Sultan to send their son to govern Aleppo, not because he's ready, but because she wants to keep him away from palace politics, away from danger, away from the other sons, because when sons grow up the games get bloodier. Next, we enter the silk-draped world of espionage, where concubines double as informants, messengers and quiet threats. There's a phrase whispered in the harem that's never written down: the eyes have no veil. In a place built on secrecy, it's a gentle, terrifying reminder someone is always watching, and sometimes that someone wears bangles and rouge. Welcome to the shadowy, silk-laced world of harem espionage, where concubines aren't just pretty faces but finely trained instruments of intelligence, manipulation and betrayal. You might think of spies as trench-coated men slipping through back alleys or hiding behind bookshelves in smoky cafes. But here in the Topkapi harem, espionage comes with henna'd hands and perfume bottles. The Sultan's palace was more than just the administrative heart of the empire. It was also its surveillance hub. Everyone was listening, and everyone was being listened to. Let's start with the basics. The concubines were not all passive pawns. Some of them were positioned, planted even, to collect information. Messages passed in embroidery patterns, political secrets traded between bathhouse whispers, and if a concubine could secure a single piece of useful intelligence, it could change her standing overnight. Who used this information? Primarily the Valide Sultan. As the nerve centre of the harem, she cultivated her own intelligence network. Young women were assigned to shadow rising rivals, intercept correspondence, and eavesdrop on late-night conversations. If you've ever tried to whisper beneath a marble dome, you'll know that nothing is ever truly private here. Then there were the eunuchs, especially the chief black eunuch, who essentially ran the palace's version of a spy agency. His staff reported everything: which women were forming cliques, who were sneaking notes to outer-court figures, which concubine might be hiding a book not sanctioned by the palace tutors. A misplaced letter wasn't just gossip fuel, it was political evidence, and it travelled quickly. A fringe fact you might enjoy: there are documented instances of concubines being trained in multiple languages, not for diplomacy, but for espionage. If you could understand the whispers of a visiting Persian envoy, or interpret a Russian merchant's careless insult, you suddenly became invaluable. You might even be promoted, or used for something far more delicate. Which brings us to a darker layer: spies planted by other people. Some concubines weren't born into the Ottoman system. They were sent in like gifts with teeth by foreign powers. Venice, France, Persia, they all had their eyes on the Ottoman court. And occasionally they'd send a girl not just to impress the Sultan, but to seduce information right out of him. A veiled spy, bearing poetry and perfume, with a mind sharper than any dagger. Not all succeeded. One such woman, rumoured to be Italian, rose quickly in the ranks only to disappear within weeks after being discovered reading a letter in a forbidden script. No one ever found her body. It's said her final night was spent in the Sultan's bathhouse where the steam drowned her screams. But of course, that might just be legend. In the harem, fact and fear blend until they're indistinguishable. Now imagine you're a concubine who isn't a spy but suddenly finds herself entangled in one of these webs. You're told to deliver a message. Nothing dramatic, just a folded piece of paper slid beneath a door. You do it, and the next morning the girl who asked you to do it has vanished. You realise you've been used, and worse, someone else knows you were involved. Your options? Confess and beg for mercy. Stay quiet and pray, or find someone more powerful to protect you. Fast. Information was the currency of survival. If you knew something valuable, you could barter it for favours. A better room, better food, a promise that your son might be spared if a purge came. Some concubines hoarded secrets like treasure. Others used them to ruin rivals, feeding half-truths to eunuchs or to the Valide Sultan until the target was deemed dangerous and exiled. The bathhouses were notorious for information leaks. Yes, they were places for hygiene and relaxation, but also ground zero for whispered conspiracies. Imagine dozens of women in various states of undress, steam cloaking everything, and the echo of voices bouncing off marble. It was the perfect place to accidentally overhear something, or pretend to. Rumours that began in the bathhouse could ignite fires by dawn. There's an old scholars' debate over how extensive these networks really were. Some claim the spycraft of the harem has been exaggerated by orientalist fantasists, eager to turn every woman into a femme fatale. Others argue that we've underestimated just how efficient and organised the information systems were. After all, when you lock hundreds of intelligent, ambitious women in a palace and give them nothing but time, power games are inevitable, and those games need intelligence. You pass a group of women now gathered around a low table, pretending to play chess. Their eyes flick to you, then away. One reaches for a pomegranate seed, but pauses, listening. There's something in the air. You realise someone just said a name too softly. Was it the Sultan's? The name of a vizier? You'll never know, but you do know the one who whispered it didn't move her lips. She's trained. Even the Sultan isn't safe from this invisible web. He knows it. That's why he often communicates with the Valide Sultan through a coded system. Certain coloured handkerchiefs left on trays, specific flowers sent in arrangements, even which dish he chooses from a meal can carry a subtle message. A bowl of quince jam, that means yes. Rosewater rice pudding, wait. And don't think for a second that the harem spies only played defence. Sometimes they went on the offensive. Eunuchs were dispatched with letters laced in flattery and hints, sent to ministers the women wanted to influence, or blackmail. In rare cases, a concubine might feed a forged rumour into the court just to stir chaos, then sit back and watch her rivals scramble. The power was quiet, invisible. No sword, no decree, just knowledge. And in a place where knowledge could lead to favour and favour to survival, these women learned to listen better than any diplomat. Tonight, as the oil lamps flicker and the corridors fall into hush, you can hear the shifting of slippers in the distance. Somewhere, someone is delivering a message, and someone else is pretending not to notice. Next, we dive headfirst into the darker heart of the harem, where rivalry turns deadly and survival means eliminating the competition. If you're imagining the harem as one long, fragrant slumber party, well, let's correct that right now. Behind the soft laughter, beneath the layers of brocade and rosewater, the harem was a war zone. Not with swords or armies. No, but this was a battleground of whispers and cosmetics, poisoned pastries and misplaced jewellery, secret letters and very calculated tears. Tonight, you're stepping into the dark art of rivalry inside the Ottoman harem. And trust me, this is where things get vicious. You already know the stakes. Promotion means better food, better chambers, more influence, and above all, safety. Demotion? That's the beginning of the end. But you can't rise without someone else falling. So every smile from one concubine to another is just a blade turned handle first, for now. Because the second someone else gets summoned by the Sultan, or receives a necklace you thought was yours, that same smile curdles. It starts with rumours, small things. A whisper that someone used the Sultan's favourite cologne without permission, that another girl is secretly writing poetry under a pseudonym, an offence that could lead to expulsion if it's seen as political. Or the classic, that a concubine is sleeping with a eunuch. True or not, the seed is enough. Once a rumour takes root, it's passed along by wet hands in the bathhouse or under silk sheets during a shared evening. Prayer. Before you know it, the eunuchs report the concerns to the Valide Sultan, and punishment follows. What does punishment look like in a place like this? Sometimes it's overt. A demotion, removal from court ceremonies, reassignment to the laundry chambers. But often, it's subtle. Meals arrive colder. Gifts stop coming. The Sultan's eyes don't land on you during the morning procession. And then, maybe one night, you're summoned. And instead of being led to the Sultan's chamber, you're escorted to a carriage and sent to a distant palace. Or worse, to a convent. And let's talk about poison. Yes, actual poison. Fringe fact: the harem had strict controls on food preparation, but that didn't stop certain women from slipping enhancements into tea or honeyed dates. Some were intended to cause illness, others sterility. A woman who bore a son was powerful, but one who couldn't, a harmless flower, a safe pawn. You see the logic, and you see why the kitchens had their own locked protocol. Every dish tasted first by servants, every cup inspected. The competition often escalated around pregnancy. The moment a woman showed signs of carrying the Sultan's child, she became a walking target. There were no guarantees in childbirth. Not then, not now, but back then, a complication could mean death. And not all complications were natural. A jealous rival could arrange for a clumsy slip on the stairs, a misdiagnosed illness, or an herbal remedy slipped in under the guise of easing morning sickness. Now, of course, not every rivalry was fatal. Some were long games, alliances built, broken, and rebuilt over years. Concubines often formed cliques, subtle sororities of convenience. They'd protect each other, share rumours, even coordinate wardrobes to flatter one another. But make no mistake, when the moment came, self-preservation always won out. It had to. You walk through the corridors now and feel it, the tension humming just beneath the surface. A young cariye trips, spilling a tray of incense. Another girl laughs too loudly. Everyone turns. Is the laugh genuine? A mock? A coded insult? Every gesture here has layers, every gaze a hidden edge. A particularly brutal story floats through the steam of the bathhouse, a tale of two favourites who rose at the same time. One bore a daughter, the other a son. The one with the daughter seemed accepting, even supportive, until the boy fell ill at 3 months. Some say it was fever. Others say the mother slipped something into his milk. The Sultan never suspected, but the Valide Sultan did. The woman with the daughter was found dead in her sleep weeks later. No marks, no trial, just silence. And yet, in spite of all the danger, women still reached out for power, still tried to rise. The risk was high, but the reward? Unparalleled. A promotion meant your son had a chance. A glance from the Sultan could mean security for life, and so the games continued. There's a debated question among historians. How much of this deadly competition was created by the system itself? Was it human nature under extreme pressure, or did the architecture of the harem, its rigid hierarchy, its enforced isolation, breed these rivalries like bacteria in a closed jar? Some argue the women had no other outlet for ambition, so they turned on each other. Others say they simply adapted to the same cutthroat world that existed outside the harem, just with more sequins. But here's something even darker to consider. Many of these rivalries were engineered. The Valide Sultan often stoked tension between factions. It helped her maintain control. Divide and conquer wasn't just a military tactic, it was a survival strategy. If two women were busy sabotaging each other, neither could rise too fast. Neither could threaten her position. So she'd offer one a gift, then compliment the other's rival. Feed them both enough attention to keep them hungry, never satisfied. As night falls over the palace again, you find yourself in a quiet garden courtyard. The moonlight glistens off the surface of a small fountain. A woman stands nearby, alone, her silhouette framed by the outline of her robe. She's humming, a song from her homeland maybe, or a warning. A eunuch watches from the shadows, silent. You wonder what she did today, what letter she intercepted, what compliment she twisted, what plan she set into motion that won't bloom for weeks. Tomorrow it might be her rival's favourite necklace that goes missing, or her favourite servant that's suddenly reassigned, or a tray of honeyed figs that arrives from an unfamiliar kitchen, and the next day, the game begins again. Next, we enter the cage where golden suns grow up locked in fear. Welcome to the world of the princes. The harem isn't just a house of women, it's also, strangely, a cradle of men. Hidden deep within Topkapi Palace lies a chamber that doesn't appear in most tourist photos. No brilliant tiles, no golden arches, just thick walls, narrow windows, and a silence that feels wrong, like the air has been squeezed thin. This is the cafes, the cage. And behind its guarded doors live the Sultan's sons. You might think being born a prince in the Ottoman Empire meant riding horses, commanding armies, and tossing coins into fountains. But no. If you're the son of the Sultan, especially one not chosen to rule, your life is a velvet-wrapped prison sentence. Because the Ottoman succession system wasn't about birth order or popularity, it was survival of the last man standing. Let's rewind a bit. In earlier centuries, Ottoman princes were sent out to govern provinces as teenagers. They were expected to learn leadership on the job, sharpen their instincts and, let's be honest, sniff out weaknesses in their brothers. Because once the Sultan died, the princes didn't sit down and draw straws, they fought. To the death. Literally. For a long time, fratricide was official policy. When a prince claimed the throne, he was expected to execute his brothers, not out of cruelty but practicality. The empire didn't have time for civil wars or multiple claimants. It was brutal but efficient. You'd think this system would have collapsed under its own violence, but it worked. For a while. Then came the backlash. As the empire aged, attitudes changed. By the early 17th century, the Ottomans began locking up their spare princes instead of executing them. Thus was born the cage, a suite of apartments inside the palace, where princes were confined indefinitely, for their protection. In theory, it was humane. In reality, it was psychological warfare in slow motion. So what was it like in the cafes? Imagine growing up knowing your very existence makes people uncomfortable. You're dangerous just by breathing. You're surrounded by guards who watch you like a snake behind glass. You have tutors, yes, and books and the occasional falcon brought in for your amusement. But you can't leave. You can't make friends. You can't fall in love. And you can't trust anyone, not even your own mother. Fringe fact. Some princes spent over 30 years in the cage before becoming sultan. One poor soul emerged in his 50s, mentally shattered, completely unaware of how the world outside had changed. Others were so inexperienced they became puppets for the Valide Sultan or power-hungry viziers. The empire suffered, the people noticed, and yet to the harem women, producing a son was still the ultimate prize. Even a life in the cage meant your bloodline had value. The Valide Sultan herself started here. As a concubine who bore the right child, every woman in the harem knew the gamble. A son could rise to the throne, or waste away in silence, but they still hoped, still prayed, still plotted. You walk the hallway now that leads to the cage, past thick wooden doors and latticed windows too high to see out of. The air is cooler here, more still. A eunuch stands nearby, eyes heavy-lidded but alert. He doesn't stop you, but he doesn't welcome you either. His presence says it all. This is sacred space, or cursed. Inside, a young prince sits at a low table, copying verses from the Quran. He's surrounded by books, cushions, and silence. He has everything, and nothing. His robes are embroidered, but not opulent. His hair is neatly tied back, but his eyes, those eyes are vacant, like someone who's never seen his own shadow in daylight. He has brothers. He knows they're somewhere in the palace, but he hasn't spoken to them in years. Maybe not ever. The guards never let them be in the same room together. Not anymore. Not since the rumours about a prince who slipped his brother poison hidden in a prayer bead. That prince died days later, not from punishment, but from the slow decay of paranoia. This is how it goes here. There's a heavy scholarly debate around the cage. Some argue it preserved stability. Better to lock up potential threats than slaughter them. Others say it created hollow rulers, emotionally stunted men who couldn't lead, who leaned too heavily on the palace women and their viziers. It's hard to argue with the results. By the time the 18th century rolled around, Ottoman leadership had begun to wobble, then sag. The mental health of the royal family wasn't just personal, it was national. But in this moment, the young prince just sighs and picks up another book. He reads about battle tactics, maps he may never use, languages he may never speak in public. He is brilliant, curious, possibly even wise, but none of that matters unless fate, or the death of a brother, says otherwise. And what about the mothers? They weren't allowed into the cage freely. Sometimes they were permitted visits, sometimes not. A concubine whose son entered the cage could rise in status, or fall into total despair. Some never saw their sons again. Others lived for the day he might ascend the throne. They prayed, they bargained. Some even tried to influence succession through the Valide Sultan, or the Sultan himself. But often, it was like trying to whisper through a locked door. You exit the cage chambers with a strange tightness in your chest. Outside, the palace hums with life, music, laughter, the rustle of fabrics. Inside, those boys sit in their gilded prison cells, waiting for either death or destiny. No in between. You wonder what kind of sultan they'd make, whether they'd be kind, whether they'd remember their years in silence and swear to do better, or whether the trauma would eat them whole. Tomorrow we slip into something lighter, sort of. The world of fashion, beauty and self-presentation in the harem. Because here, appearance isn't vanity, it's armour. By now you've seen the ambition, the whispers, the terrifying elegance of power in motion. But let's press pause on the politics, just for a breath, and wander into the glittering mirror-lined corner of the harem where the real transformations happen. This is the world of fashion, fragrance and beauty. But make no mistake, this isn't just about looking pretty. In the harem, appearance is strategy. Silk is armour, perfume is persuasion, and the line between cosmetics and combat is razor thin. Let's start with the obvious. Fabric. Nothing in this place wears as much meaning as what you wear on your back. The harem's fashion rules weren't written, but everyone knew them. Young carriers dressed modestly in plain kaftans, usually cotton, maybe thin wool if they were lucky. No embroidery, no brocade, no flashy colours. Think of it as camouflage. You don't show feathers until you know how to fly. But as a woman ascended the ranks, say, after a night in the Sultan's chambers or a flattering nod from the Valide Sultan, her wardrobe changed like a reward. Suddenly she's seen in silks, then velvets, then satins so soft they almost melt in your hands. Colours grow bolder: turquoise, saffron, pomegranate red. Patterns shift from quiet florals to imperial arabesques. By the time she reaches Kaidin or Haseki, she's practically a walking mural. And the jewellery? Let's just say it wasn't exactly subtle. Earrings dangled with pearls the size of your thumb. Bangles stacked up forearms like golden armour. Hairpins sparkled with emeralds shaped into leaves and birds. But every piece told a story. A ruby might signal royal favour. A particular brooch might be a gift from the Sultan. Or worse, a rival's signature piece, borrowed and worn as a taunt. You wander into the cosmetics room now. A chamber filled with delicate glass bottles, stone palettes, and little pots carved from ivory and mother of pearl. This is where the magic happens. Women gather around low stools, plucking each other's eyebrows, grinding pigments, mixing homemade moisturizers with rosewater, goat milk and crushed almond. Laughter drifts through the steam, but always with a wary undertone. Even beauty is competitive here. Fringe fact: many of the harem's cosmetic recipes were guarded like state secrets. One popular lip stain was made from cochineal beetles, rose oil, and the sap of a specific Anatolian tree. Another used dried figs to darken eyebrows. They even used powdered lead to whiten skin, which, yes, was as toxic as it sounds, but at the time, paleness was a prized sign of indoor leisure. The paler the skin, the higher your perceived rank. And it wasn't just about makeup. Hair care was practically a religion. Long, lustrous hair was a symbol of youth, beauty, and fertility. Women oiled their hair with sesame and almond oil, sometimes infusing it with jasmine or musk. Hair was brushed hundreds of times a day. Seriously, hundreds. With wooden combs dipped in scented water. And when not on display, it was wrapped, braided, or tucked under silk scarves that matched the day's colour scheme. Yes, colour scheme. Coordination was crucial. And let's not forget fragrance. The harem was quite literally a cloud of competing aromas. There were rules, certain scents for certain times. Light rose or lavender during the day, musk and ambergris for the evening, sandalwood or frankincense for rituals. And if you wanted to make a statement, you created your own blend. Some women were so famous for their scent trails that their approach was announced not by footsteps, but by fragrance alone. But beauty wasn't just external. In the harem, being refined was as important as being radiant. Women were taught how to read poetry, how to sing in multiple languages, how to dance not just with their bodies, but with their eyes. A concubine might spend hours learning how to pour coffee in perfect silence, or how to kneel and present a tray with just the right tilt of the wrist. Everything was calculated, everything choreographed. You pass a mirror now, tall, Venetian, ringed in silver. A gift, maybe, from some foreign ambassador who thought a luxury. Mirror would win him a favour. It didn't. But it's still here. and countless women have practiced their looks in it. Smiles, sighs, glances over the shoulder, not out of vanity but readiness. You don't just walk into the Sultan's presence, you rehearse it. One of the more fascinating scholarly debates centres around how beauty standards evolved in the harem. Some historians believe the Sultan's preferences shaped everything. If he liked full lips or narrow waists, the whole harem adapted. Others argue the women influenced the Sultan's taste, slowly training him to desire what they could offer. And then there's the possibility that trends came from beyond. Persian art, European envoys, Egyptian fashion all left fingerprints on harem aesthetics. In truth, it was likely all of the above, a feedback loop of influence and adaptation. But here's something no scholar disputes. Beauty could be dangerous. The more beautiful you were, the more eyes you attracted. Not all friendly. A new concubine with striking looks could find herself sabotaged before she even stepped foot in the Sultan's chambers. Dresses slashed, cosmetics tampered with, perfume bottles replaced with vinegar. The harem was ruthless. Gorgeous, yes, but ruthless. And yet, amidst all this danger, there was real artistry. Women created entire identities through their fashion and appearance. They carved power out of aesthetics, expressing not just survival, but style, wit, defiance. One concubine wore nothing but white for an entire year. Another was known for painting tiny birds on her nails. A third only spoke in couplets when summoned, both maddening and mesmerizing. As the sun sets, the last of the mirrors are covered with cloth. A superstition, some say uncovered mirrors trap souls after dark. Others say it's just to protect the glass from moisture. But either way, the chamber goes dim, and the women retire with oiled skin and unspoken ambitions. Tomorrow, one of them may be summoned. She will step forward in peacock-coloured velvet, smelling of sandalwood and rose, her lips dark with beetle-stained balm. And if she plays her part well enough, she might rise, or she might vanish. Next, we turn to the stories no one was supposed to tell. The forbidden romances, the love affairs that defied every law of the palace. Love is not welcome here. Not the soft, breathless kind whispered under olive trees or sealed in folded letters tied with ribbons. In the harem, love is a liability. A crack in the marble floor, a rope someone can pull to make you fall. Every woman is taught this early. The Sultan may show you favour. He may even show you tenderness. But do not mistake it for love. That kind of mistake gets you killed. Or worse, ignored. And yet, of course, it happens. Tonight, we tiptoe into the most forbidden corner of the harem. Secret romance. Not the sanctioned intimacy of a sultan's invitation, but real, unsanctioned affection. Two people finding one another, through layers of silk and silence. A concubine and a eunuch. A woman and another woman. Even in the rarest and most dangerous cases, a concubine and an outsider. Perhaps a visiting scholar, a guard too slow to look away, or the son of a minister who catches a glimpse behind the veil. Let's start with what everyone already suspected. Not all relationships in the harem were about the Sultan. With hundreds of women locked together, some for decades, bonds formed, deep ones. Sisterhood, yes, but also longing. Some of these women entered the harem as children. They grew up together, bathed together, cried on the same nights. It's no surprise that a few found comfort in each other's arms. Whispered poetry, hidden touches, shared sheets in winter. Was it love? Was it rebellion? Maybe both. Fringe fact, there are records, cryptic, heavily edited, of two concubines caught inappropriately close in the bathhouse. The punishment wasn't execution, but permanent separation. One was transferred to another palace. The other, promoted oddly enough. Some believe the Valide Sultan found the pairing inconvenient but saw potential in one of them. It's the kind of political coin toss that defines life in the harem. Heads, you fall in love. Tails, you become a ruler's favourite. Now imagine falling for someone outside the harem. That's where things get lethal. Eunuchs, technically, were the only men allowed inside the harem. But despite their official status, they were still men. Thinking, feeling, breathing. And they too sometimes slipped. Or maybe the concubines did. There are plenty of whispered tales of midnight meetings in laundry corridors, secret messages tucked into food trays, and glances that lingered just a second too long. One story tells of a concubine who fell in love with a high-ranking eunuch, not physically, but emotionally. They played chess, discussed poetry. He taught her to write in Arabic script so she could compose her own verses. No one suspected them at first, but when she was summoned by the Sultan and requested the eunuch be present to serve tea, eyebrows raised. Shortly after, he was reassigned. She was sent to a quieter chamber. A few weeks later, she stopped singing. Her voice was never heard again. Did anything happen between them? Who knows? Maybe it was just friendship in a place that outlawed friendship. But perception was poison here. Some tales are more dramatic. There are rumours, unconfirmed but persistent, of a concubine who attempted to flee the harem for a soldier she met at a festival. He had delivered fabric, supposedly, and caught her eye. She arranged to meet him near the palace stables. They never made it. Her body was found floating in the Bosphorus 3 days later. His? Never found at all. The Valide Sultan, according to the rumour, ordered it herself. The official policy was simple. No man, besides the Sultan, could touch a harem woman. Even the possibility of romance threatened the legitimacy of heirs. If a woman became pregnant, the palace needed to be certain of the child's father. Any breach of that certainty shook the empire. So love was not romantic, it was criminal. And yet, the heart doesn't care about empires. Some concubines fell for each other and wrote poems hidden in books of religious verse. Others found comfort in the eyes of a servant girl, or in a hand brushing a wrist during an evening dance rehearsal. One particularly bold favourite was said to have had a quiet affair with a visiting calligrapher. He praised her handwriting too often, and her rooms began filling with scrolls. When he was reassigned, she began writing messages to herself just to see his lettering. It's heartbreak in ink. You walk now past the library chambers, dimly lit, filled with old Persian and Arabic love poetry. You run your fingers over spines once touched by women who wanted to feel something more than duty. Behind you, 2 girls giggle softly. Maybe it's innocent, maybe it isn't. Either way, you don't turn around. Some things are safer left unacknowledged. One of the most famous scholarly debates surrounds the question of whether these romances actually threatened the palace. Some historians argue they were overblown. Few women ever acted on forbidden desires, and the occasional rumours were just fuel for drama. Others insist these passions posed real risks. Not because they would bring down the empire, but because they offered a taste of freedom in a place built on control. And freedom, however small, is contagious. In a strange twist, some sultans tolerated more than we'd expect. There are records of a concubine caught exchanging notes with a musician. Punished? Yes, but not executed. One sultan supposedly laughed and said, "At least she didn't write to the Grand Vizier." Maybe he saw it as harmless, or maybe he remembered what it felt like to be young and caged by duty. Still, the rule remained. Love the sultan, or love no one. Anything else? Treason. As the lamps flicker to life once more, a concubine stands at her mirror, smoothing her dress. She closes her eyes and whispers something. A name, maybe, one no one else will hear. Then she walks to the courtyard, takes her place, and smiles as if she's never broken a rule in her life. Tomorrow we meet the ones who did break the rules, fully, publicly, and tried to escape. Some succeeded, most didn't. If you've been paying attention, you know that nothing, absolutely nothing in the harem happens without permission. Not movement, not music, not meals. So imagine what it takes to do the unthinkable. To leave. Not in a ceremony, not as a promoted consort being married off, but as a fugitive, breaking free of golden bars with nothing but instinct and desperation. Tonight we follow the rare, wild thread of harem escapes, some myth, some memory, all soaked in risk. First, let's understand just how hard it was to leave. The harem was designed like a fortress within a fortress. The rooms, the gates, the guards, each layer locked tighter than the one before. The black eunuchs weren't just ceremonial figures, they were living keys. They knew every door, every passage, every protocol, and they were loyal, not out of love, but out of survival. Their fates were tied to the harem's sanctity. A breach wasn't just scandalous, it was treasonous. And yet, sometimes someone tried. One of the most famous and unverified stories tells of a Circassian girl who arrived at Topkapi in the late 1600s. She was clever, quiet, and fluent in 4 languages. She worked her way up the ranks quickly, not through seduction, but through silence. But instead of using her favour to rise within the system, she plotted her way out of it. Over a year, she befriended an older eunuch whose eyesight was failing. She offered to read letters for him, help with errands. Gradually she memorized schedules, learned who stood where and when. Then one night, dressed in the garb of a servant boy and smeared with soot to darken her features, she slipped out through a food delivery gate. She was caught 3 days later on a merchant ship bound for Italy. Legend says she died smiling. Escape wasn't always about fleeing the palace. Sometimes it meant trying to disappear within it. One woman faked illness for months, avoiding summons, slipping into the lower quarters to blend with kitchen staff. She even shaved her head to avoid recognition. Eventually, a laundress recognized her hands, small, calloused, but with the unmistakable delicacy of someone trained to pour wine, not scrub linens. She was dragged back and never seen again. Fringe fact, there was once a secret tunnel underneath Topkapi Palace. It connected various wings of the compound, likely for moving between buildings during bad weather, or maybe to move people and things discreetly. Some say it was used in escape attempts, but that's debatable. The tunnel was eventually sealed. Too many whispers, too many footprints without explanations. Of course, not all escapes were spontaneous acts of desperation. Some were assisted. It's rumoured that the Valide Sultan herself occasionally allowed a quiet disappearance when it suited her. If a concubine became too popular, too dangerous, too connected to someone she shouldn't be, the Valide might arrange for her to be quietly shipped to a distant palace under the guise of a promotion. Sometimes she even gave them a stipend to start over, but it was exile, not freedom. These women were still watched, still restricted. The cage was bigger, but it was still a cage. There's a particularly haunting case of a woman who almost made it. She had family in the city, a cousin who worked as a baker in Galata. Through a series of messages passed in pastries, yes, really, they plotted her escape. On a festival day, when the harem was distracted with music and sweets, she slipped out in the chaos. She made it as far as the outer gate before a eunuch spotted her footstep pattern in the sand. Too small, too fast, wrong direction. She was caught and brought back. Her cousin's bakery mysteriously burned down days later. And what about the women who wanted to leave but didn't dare? They fantasized, of course. They watched birds and envied their wings. They dreamed of walking through a market, buying bread with real coins, not with tokens of favour. They imagined being called by their real names again, names they hadn't spoken since they were children. Some tried to bargain their way out by pledging to serve the empire in a nunnery or foreign court. Others simply stopped eating, stopped speaking, hoping to be released through pity or fear. It rarely worked. A historical debate still lingers around how many women actually wanted to escape. Were they prisoners or protected wards? Some accounts suggest many concubines preferred harem life to poverty or rural hardship. After all, they had shelter, education, status and safety if they followed the rules. Others argue that this is the language of institutionalization, that the women learned to love the cage because the outside world was kept a terrifying mystery. The truth? Likely both. Human minds adapt to survive. Occasionally women did leave the harem, but only with permission. Retired concubines were sometimes married off to loyal generals, ministers or provincial governors. These were ceremonial departures, draped in honour and watched carefully. Even then, the women were expected to remain silent about their former lives. They were given new names, new wardrobes, and a fresh start, under heavy surveillance. But what about the ones who made it? Did anyone actually escape and live freely? There's one legend, only one. A French traveller in the 18th century wrote of meeting a woman in Venice who claimed to have once lived in the Sultan's harem. She spoke perfect Turkish, Persian, and Arabic. She wore her hair in the Ottoman style but dressed in Italian silks. She had a crescent-shaped scar on her shoulder. When asked how she left the palace, she laughed and said, "I didn't leave, I vanished." Was she telling the truth? No one knows. She died with no record of her birth, no family, no possessions beyond a set of prayer beads and a pair of emerald earrings engraved with verses from the Quran. Tonight, as the palace quiets and the oil lamps dim, a young cariye sits at her window. She's watching the moon. She's tracing the shape of the gate she's never passed through. And she's thinking, just for a second, what if I ran? What would happen? Would anyone even notice I was gone? Next time, we'll see what happens when escape isn't an option. When the Sultan dies, and the harem explodes into chaos. Death comes quietly in the harem, even when it wears a crown. There is no trumpet blast when the Sultan dies, no wild clamour, no mourning procession through the marble halls. Instead, the palace freezes. Every breath, every slippered step slows to a hush. You feel it in the air before anyone dares say the words. The Sultan is gone. Now, the harem doesn't collapse in tears. Not at first. There are no wails, no women flinging themselves dramatically into fountains. Instead, there's a silence so sharp it feels like someone's drawn a blade across the sky. Because death in the palace doesn't just mean sorrow, it means chaos, reshuffling, recalculation. The entire balance of power shifts in the blink of an eye. This is what they all feared. You stand in the outer corridor now, the scent of burnt rose petals wafting from the bathhouse, and already the palace feels different. Eunuchs walk faster, glancing sideways. Concubines whisper in clusters, lips barely moving. The Valide Sultan's private chamber is sealed. No one enters, not even her closest attendants. She's either preparing for war or mourning in her own way. Why the panic? Because with the Sultan gone, the throne is vacant, and the question that will decide the fate of everyone in this palace, who now wears the sword, isn't answered in a council room. It's answered in blood and behind closed doors. Remember those princes locked away in the cafes? This is their cue. Somewhere deep in the palace, the chief black eunuch is already moving, keys in hand, orders clenched in his palm. He's heading to the cage to release the chosen heir, maybe a son everyone knew about, maybe a distant relative pulled from obscurity. Whoever it is, his first breath as Sultan puts everyone else in danger. Why? Because with a new Sultan comes a new Valide Sultan, and the old one, she just became politically irrelevant, or worse, a threat. Fringe fact: Ottoman tradition once dictated that all brothers of a new Sultan should be executed upon his ascension. That policy softened over time, mostly, but the fear never did. Women who bore princes now fear for their children's lives. Concubines who were favourites of the previous Sultan suddenly find themselves at best redundant, at worst politically toxic. The new Sultan may view them as spies, as remnants of the old regime, and the new Valide Sultan, if she's not already in place, expect a brutal Game of Thrones within the harem itself. You pass a chamber now where two concubines are unpacking chests, but they're not reorganising. They're hiding valuables, gems, letters, perfumes laced with coded messages. One wraps a strand of pearls around her ankle and tucks it under her robe. The other slips a letter into a hollowed-out prayer book. They don't speak. They just know. The bathhouse, usually full of relaxed chatter and scented steam, is silent tonight. Women bathe in shifts, quickly. No laughing, no singing. Everyone's preparing for whatever comes next, because no one's position is secure anymore, not even the servants. A story drifts through the palace about a concubine named Gulra, a minor favourite of the previous Sultan. When he died, she was demoted instantly. The new Valide Sultan ordered her removed from her rooms. When she refused, eunuchs dragged her out, her feet leaving streaks on the marble. No one knows where she went. Some say a distant palace, others say the sea. Her name was erased from the harem records within a week, and the eunuchs? They shift alliances faster than wind through curtains. The chief black eunuch survives by backing the right prince. If he chooses poorly, he may be executed within days. If he chooses wisely, he keeps his power and gains more. The rest of the eunuchs follow his lead, adjusting their loyalties like traders watching a volatile market. Back in the inner chamber, the Valide Sultan has made her move. You can tell by the way a group of concubines suddenly stand at attention as her chief servant emerges with the list in hand. It's not a death list, not yet. But it's a movement list. Who's being reassigned? Who's losing their chamber? Who's being transferred? Subtle rearrangements with violent implications, and somewhere near the bottom, names marked for removal. No explanation. No appeal. This is the unravelling. Scholars argue whether the harem was truly this brutal in moments of transition. Some say the drama has been exaggerated, painted in too much blood by Western travellers eager to see the Orient as lawless and exotic. Others, relying on letters and court records, argue that these power shifts did trigger violence, sometimes state-sanctioned, sometimes personal. After all, when your entire identity depends on favour, and favour disappears, what's left? Even those untouched by power tremble. Servants who worked for the deceased sultan may be dismissed or executed for knowing too much. Musicians are told not to play his favourite songs. Tutors must erase certain histories from the prince's curriculum. One mistake, one accidental reference to the wrong ruler, and your head might end up in the garden. You enter the sultan's former bedchamber. It's cold now. The lamps are dim. The scent of his favourite musk still clinging to the curtains. The divan where he once lay with favourites is stripped. There are no flowers, just folded linens and absence. Then comes the moment, the announcement. A eunuch enters the courtyard, raises a silk-draped scroll, and declares the name of the new sultan. A name no one is surprised to hear, and yet still, everyone holds their breath. Because now it's real. Now the new order begins. Within hours, new alliances will be formed, old favours will be called in, and those on the wrong side of history, already too late. The women kneel as one, not out of respect, out of calculation. Among them is a woman with no children, no title, no favours left. She bows with the others, her face still, but inside, she's already preparing. She knows the new Valide Sultan used to hate her, that she once laughed too loudly at a dinner where her rival spilled wine, that she once wore a necklace gifted to both of them. She doesn't plan to run, she plans to survive. Tomorrow, we follow the women who took survival to the next level, those who stepped outside the harem and began shaping the world beyond its walls. Not every woman in the harem stayed behind the screens. Some slipped through the cracks in the marble and found themselves in spaces that were never meant to be theirs. In embassies, in diplomatic salons, in the glittering, dangerous courts of foreign lands. Tonight, you walk with the sultanas abroad, the women who left the harem not in secret, not in chains, but in splendour. They were not concubines anymore. They were ambassadors, emissaries, and sometimes legends. Let's begin with the truth. The harem wasn't meant to export women. These weren't souvenirs. They weren't diplomatic gifts, despite what some European letters smugly claimed. But circumstances, war, politics, strategy, sometimes bent the rules, and when they did, these women carried with them the mystery of the harem like a cloak stitched in rumour. They weren't just foreign, they were forbidden, which, as you know, makes them irresistible. Some women were sent abroad as part of arranged marriages. A provincial governor with questionable loyalty, give him a wife from the palace, a concubine loyal to the dynasty, trained in etiquette, educated and accustomed to court life. A sultan's daughter, born to a favoured consort, might be married off to a powerful ally to solidify a treaty or smooth over a rebellion. But don't mistake these women for passive brides. They were watchers, record keepers, insurance policies in silk. One of the earliest examples dates back to the reign of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. His daughter, Mihrimah Sultan, born to Harem, was married to Rustam Pasha, the Grand Vizier. But Mihrimah was no mere bride. She played a critical role in diplomacy, allegedly sending letters to foreign courts and advising her father on naval campaigns. She even funded mosques and schools in her own name. Her correspondence with European nobles, still debated, still fascinating. You pass a painted screen now, depicting a sultana arriving at a palace in Cairo. She's wearing a red velvet cloak, gold coins in her hair, and her eyes fixed not on the men awaiting her, but on the city itself, like she's sizing up her next move. The painting isn't labelled. No one remembers her name, but her image survived, and that tells you everything you need to know. Fringe fact. During the 18th century, a few high-ranking Ottoman women were allowed to travel to European cities, not as exiles or escapees, but as cultural envoys. One such woman, known only in Venetian letters as La Signora di Costantinopoli, attended masked balls in disguise. She spoke fluent Italian, carried Turkish silks in her trunks, and was rumoured to be a former harem favourite turned diplomatic liaison. Her actual identity remains a mystery. Some think she was the daughter of a vizier. Others whisper she was a Haseki who negotiated her freedom in exchange for silence. Even when they didn't leave the empire, these women still made waves beyond its borders. European ambassadors often tried to reach them through bribes, gifts, or go-betweens. The Valide Sultan was particularly sought after. Foreign envoys knew that gaining her favour could mean better trade terms, postponed taxes, or access to the Sultan's ear. Some tried to send perfumes or portraits, others sent mechanical toys. One ambitious French ambassador even sent a live peacock with a ribbon around its neck. The Valide never responded, but the bird stayed. Scholars argue about how much direct influence these women had on diplomacy. Some say they merely passed messages, others insist they were active negotiators, steering imperial decisions from behind a veil. Evidence, letters, gifts, sudden changes in policy that coincided with a rise in a particular woman's status. Correlation isn't causation, but in the harem, correlation was often all you needed to get very dead or very promoted. You walk now through a long corridor lined with windows, rare in this part of the palace. Outside, the Bosphorus sparkles. This was the view granted to favoured women, and it's through this view that many first glimpsed the idea of a world beyond the gates. Ships passed daily, headed to Venice, to France, to Egypt. The women would watch, listen to the eunuchs gossip about far-off lands, and imagine themselves walking freely in those cities. Some would make it there. One legendary figure, Haseki Sultan, was born in the harem and later sent to the Balkans as the wife of a governor. She ended up running his court like a miniature Topkapi, complete with her own staff of musicians, scribes, and spies. When he died, she didn't return to Istanbul. She took over his role unofficially for nearly 3 years, until the central court stepped in. Even then, they sent a replacement and let her keep the mansion. Why? Because by then, she was the power in that region. But not all sultanas abroad were success stories. Some were sent away to neutralise them. Too ambitious, too persuasive, too beloved by the sultan's rivals. Being gifted in marriage could be a thinly veiled punishment. These women often lived in shadow, their names erased from the palace records. A few left memoirs smuggled into Europe and published anonymously. Most were lost. Still, the legacy lingers. When European women wrote home after visiting Istanbul, they often spoke in awed tones about the harem's political savvy. One wrote, "I expected cages. I found courtrooms." Another said the Valide Sultan had more influence than 3 ministers combined and much better shoes. Their letters spread across salons and universities, fueling both fascination and fear. The East, it seemed, had women who ruled without ever lifting a sword, and this terrified people. As the stars rise, above Topkapi you sit beneath the carved eaves of the garden pavilion, and imagine a woman in embroidered silk stepping onto a ship. Behind her, the harem. Before her, a new land where no one knows her name. Yet, she carries nothing but her memory and her strategy. Next, we rip through fantasy to reveal the truth, how the harem has been misunderstood, fetishized, and flattened by centuries of orientalist myth. Let's set something straight right now. Most of what you think you know about the harem is probably wrong. Not your fault. Blame the travel writers, the oil painters, the 19th century novelists with their sweaty imaginations and serious boundary issues. Somewhere along the road between reality and the Western fantasy machine, the Ottoman harem stopped being a political powerhouse and turned into a soft-focused daydream of reclining women and endless erotic leisure. Spoiler, there were no orgies, no giant feather fans, no golden bathtubs shaped like swans. Tonight we're cracking open the myths and letting the air in. Let's begin with the image, the Western Orientalist harem painting. You know the one. Dozens of women lounging around in various stages of undress, draped over divans with their eyes half-lidded like they've been waiting all day for a guy to show up and make decisions. These paintings, hundreds of them, filled the salons of Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, feeding a hunger not for truth but for exotic spectacle. They weren't painted by people who'd seen the harem. They were painted by people who'd heard just enough to let their imagination do the rest. One of the most famous offenders, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. His Grand Odalisque features a woman with an impossible spine and a complete disregard for how human bodies actually function. She's nude, aloof, clearly meant to be gazed upon. It's art, yes, but it's also fantasy. Ingres never set foot in a harem. His models were French. His understanding of Ottoman life, about as accurate as a soap opera set in space. But the damage was done. These images stuck. They were seductive, harmless, people thought, just decoration. Except they weren't. They shaped how the West saw the East, lazy, decadent, over-sexualized, and they erased the actual lives of the women inside the harem, reducing them to props in someone else's fantasy. Fringe fact: some Western writers did get inside the harem. Sort of. They were usually women, diplomats' wives or missionaries, invited in for carefully curated visits. But even those accounts were unreliable. The women were shown the best rooms, fed sweets, serenaded by musicians. They wrote home in flowery prose. The women were draped in gold and laughter, their eyes full of secrets. What they didn't see? The political manoeuvring, the tension, the 30 other women cleaning floors, or the pregnant concubine praying her child survives. So what was the real harem like? Structured, strict, highly educated? These women weren't idle. They were trained. In music, languages, poetry, Islamic studies, diplomacy. Many could quote Persian verse and recite Quranic passages while embroidering complex motifs. Their days were scheduled down to the hour. Less Netflix and chill, more lesson practice, pray, repeat. Advancement didn't come through seduction. It came through discipline and cleverness. The Sultan didn't just want a pretty face. He wanted someone who could hold a conversation, advise him, even challenge him. The real harem wasn't a free-for-all love buffet. The Sultan didn't lounge on cushions picking whichever woman caught his eye that day. In fact, he had a strict rotation system. Only the Valide Sultan and the chief black eunuch managed who was summoned and when. And once a woman had a child with the Sultan, she was off the roster. No more bedroom visits. Her life shifted to motherhood, education, and court strategy. Another myth worth busting: the idea that all harem women were slaves. Yes, most began as slaves or captives, but slavery in the Ottoman context wasn't a fixed condition. Many women were manumitted, freed, after years of service, given property, married to elite men, or even elevated to positions of immense power. Think of it less as a sentence and more as an entrance into a brutal, complex system, one where status could be earned and danger lurked with every promotion. You walk now through the long corridor known as the Altan Yol, the Golden Road. It's named not for its literal glitter, but for the tradition of the Sultan tossing coins along its length during festivals. This is the hallway Orientalist writers love to describe. A path of jewels beneath the soft feet of celestial women. Sounds dreamy, right? In reality, it was a route between the women's quarters and the Sultan's chambers. Functional, dimly lit, no jewels, maybe a cat or two. And about those legendary harem baths. Yes, they existed. They were gorgeous. But they weren't erotic playgrounds. They were crowded, noisy, full of rules. Women washed quickly, modestly, often while discussing politics or preparing for upcoming ceremonies. They weren't lounging around waiting to be sketched. They were trying to rinse off the weight of the day without accidentally saying something that would be reported. The biggest misunderstanding of all, that the women in the harem were prisoners. They weren't free, certainly, not in the modern sense, but they weren't helpless either. They were political players, power brokers, mothers of future sultans, architects of policy. The Valide Sultan, remember, often had more influence than the Grand Vizier. And concubines weren't just dancers or entertainers, they were diplomats in disguise. Scholars today are still correcting the record. New translations of palace records, personal letters, and endowment documents reveal how active these women were. They built mosques, schools, soup, kitchens. They commissioned libraries, oversaw estates, arranged marriages. Their names appear on land deeds and donation plaques across Istanbul and beyond. One former concubine even funded an entire aqueduct system for a drought-stricken village. Exotic who? And yet the myths persist. You overhear a tour guide in the outer courtyard explaining the harem with a chuckle. This is where the Sultan kept all his wives. Close your eyes. Count to 10. Try not to throw anything. Because even now, centuries later, the story that sticks is the one that flatters the imagination, not the one that honours the truth. As the moonlight spills across the tiled roofs of Topkapi, you look up and wonder how many lives, how many real stories, were painted over in soft focus fantasy. You can't blame the art, but you can refuse to believe it. Next, we step into the blueprints of secrecy themselves. How the empire's greatest architect built the harem not just for beauty, but for power and surveillance. Topkapi Palace doesn't just hold secrets, it's made of them. Every arch, every corridor, Every mosaic-splashed wall in the harem was designed not just to dazzle, but to conceal. You've seen the women, the rituals, the rivalries, but have you noticed how easily people disappear into shadows here? How the space turns corners without warning? How whispers don't carry unless you want them to? That's no accident. Tonight we follow the mind behind it all. Mimar Sinan, the Empire's master architect, and the man who made sure the harem remained hidden in plain sight. Now, Sinan isn't just any builder with a knack for domes. He was the Ottoman Michelangelo, an ex-Christian convert who rose through the ranks to become chief imperial architect under 3 sultans, including Suleiman the Magnificent. The man built over 300 structures in his lifetime, from mosques to bridges to aqueducts. But here in the harem, he didn't just build, he engineered control. Let's start with the layout. The harem is deliberately confusing, an architectural labyrinth with no clear beginning or end. If you came in as a guest, not that many did, you'd be instantly disoriented. The passageways twist and narrow, branching into courtyards that open like breath, then vanish into tight turns. Some doors open into music rooms, others into nothing but blank walls. It's disarming, and it's designed to be. This is spatial hierarchy. Women of higher rank were given chambers on upper floors, with better air, better light, and, of course, better views of the Bosphorus. Novices stayed in the interior cells. No windows, no access, just quiet, controlled space. Even your location inside the building was a signal of status. Not just to the Sultan, but to the other women. You knew where you stood. Literally. And then there's the acoustics. Ever wonder how the Valide Sultan always seemed to know what was going on? It wasn't just spies. Sinan designed the harem's domes and ceilings to play tricks with sound. In some rooms, whispers carried like rumours on wind. In others, screams barely reached the next wall. Sound moved selectively, like a jealous god. A fact, a punishment, a security feature. Fringe fact, some of the harem's fountains weren't just decorative. They created noise barriers. The soft gurgling of water masked conversation, particularly in the Sultan's private chamber. It made eavesdropping difficult, if not impossible. So while a concubine shared a poem or a political plea during pillow talk, her words dissolved in the burble. Romantic? Maybe. Strategic? Definitely. Lighting was another tool in Sinan's toolbox. The harem gets surprisingly little direct sunlight. Instead, light filters in through high windows, coloured glass and angled shafts that glow and fade as the day passes. It makes the air feel thick, dreamlike. But this too serves a purpose. Subdued light means fewer sharp shadows. You're less likely to spot someone watching, or following, or listening. You step now into the courtyard of the Queen Mother, a wide quiet space with a central fountain and polished stone flooring. It's framed by arches that are elegant but imposing. This was her space. Sinan made sure of that. Her apartments overlook the courtyard directly, giving her the best view in the house. Not just of the garden, but of you. Always. The Valide Sultan's chambers are slightly elevated, just enough to feel like a throne. Her windows are screened with intricately carved wood, allowing her to look out without being seen. You might think you're alone in the courtyard. You're not. She's watching. And then there's the Sultan's passageway, his private entrance to the harem, designed so he could come and go without anyone seeing him. A single turn, a hidden staircase, and suddenly he's in the Hazoda, the sacred chamber, without ever walking past another soul. No witnesses, no rivals, just him and his decision. This secret path was not just practical, it was psychological. His entrance was magic, appearing out of nowhere, always unexpected. It reinforced the idea that he was everywhere and nowhere, omnipresent, like Allah, but in fur-lined slippers. Scholars still debate how much of this was Sinan's invention versus imperial instruction. Some argue he was simply following orders. Build a palace, keep it private, make it beautiful. Others insist Sinan embedded his own signature touches, subtle expressions of control and reverence. He wanted the harem to feel like a sanctuary and a trap. What's more, Sinan understood the symbolic weight of space. The domes in the harem mimic the great mosques he designed. Smaller, yes, but still celestial, as if to say, this place is not just royal, it's sacred. Women praying under these domes are not just supplicants, they are chosen. Even imprisoned, they are holy. You walk now through the corridor that leads to the music room. On either side, ceramic tiles, gleam, hand-painted Iznik tiles, each more detailed than the last. Sinan could have gone simple here, but he didn't. He chose tulips, pomegranates, and calligraphy, symbols of beauty, fertility, power, a reminder that even the walls speak. One particularly stunning tile bears a verse. In silence grows strength. Fitting. Of course, beauty isn't always benign. The palace is full of decoys, doors that go nowhere, windows that open onto solid walls. Escape is impossible not because of the guards, but because even the architecture conspires against you. It's like walking through a dream stitched shut at the edges. Fringe fact number 2, because we're feeling generous. Sinan built secret storage spaces into some chambers, small, unseen cupboards where women could hide letters, keepsakes, or forbidden books. Most were never found. Some were, years later, like the chamber where a stash of French love poems was discovered in a hollow beam. The woman who hid them, unknown, but her rebellion remains. And even now, centuries later, the design holds. Visitors walk through the harem and feel dizzy, like they've stepped into a memory half remembered. They can't explain why they lose their sense of direction, why their voices sound strange, why they feel watched. That's Sinan, still here, still working. The harem was never just a place for women to wait. It was a living, breathing organism of control, precision, surveillance. And the man who built it, he gave them no hiding places, only mirrors and walls that listened. Next, we step into the quietest rebellion. How women used music and poetry to defy, to dream, and sometimes to declare war. In a world ruled by silence, where power whispers behind veils and punishments arrive without warning, you'd think expression would be dangerous, and you'd be right. But danger didn't stop the women of the harem from speaking. It just taught them to be clever, to speak without speaking, to sing with meaning hidden beneath melody, to write verses so beautiful no one noticed the sharp edges underneath. Tonight, we step into the music and poetry of the Ottoman harem, the softest rebellion ever set to rhythm. Let's start with the obvious. Music was everywhere in the harem, not just for entertainment, but for education, diplomacy, even worship. Girls arrived with barely a word of Turkish and were taught the language through song. They practiced on the canon, a zither-like string instrument, the say, a reed flute with a voice like wind over water, and the oud, short-necked lute, ancestor of the guitar. The harem had its own music tutors, some eunuchs, some women, some hired secretly from the outer court. Lessons weren't optional. Everyone was expected to sing and to listen. And what were they listening to? Everything. Classical Ottoman compositions, Persian love ballads, Arabic devotional hymns. But the real treasure was the original work, the songs and poems written by the women themselves, passed down, copied in hidden notebooks, or memorized like sacred spells. Poetry wasn't a hobby in the harem, it was survival. Writing poems gave these women a voice they weren't allowed to have in court. They could describe love, loss, homesickness, jealousy, betrayal, and frame it all in metaphors so gorgeous no one could accuse them outright of sedition. You couldn't say, "I miss my homeland and loathe this velvet prison," but you could write, "The pomegranate weeps in silk, her seeds buried under brocade, she watches the river and waits, but the water never looks back." That's not a complaint, that's art. One fringe fact for you. Some harem women became so skilled in poetry that their work was published, under male pseudonyms of course. One concubine from the early 17th century, known only as Layla of the Gardens, had her verses circulated in Istanbul's coffee houses. They were read aloud alongside those of famous male poets. No one knew she was a woman, or if they did, they kept quiet. Her most famous line, "In silence, even fire takes shape." You're in the music chamber now, a domed room with patterned tiles and soft cushions. Two girls are rehearsing a duet on the tanbur, their fingers moving like dancers across strings. Their eyes are focused, but their voices, those are elsewhere. They drift, break, and rejoin, like two thoughts trying to escape the same cage. You wonder if the song is one they've written themselves. Probably. Music here isn't just performance, it's permission to feel. The Valide Sultan encouraged music, not because she was sentimental, but because it was useful. A well-timed song could diffuse tension. A verse quoted during a conversation could replace a threat. One former Haseki once sang a lullaby at a palace banquet that included a line about the lion forgetting the scent of his favourite flower. Everyone clapped. 2 weeks later, the Sultan stopped visiting her rival's chamber. That's what we call subtle assassination. There was danger, of course. Say too much, and you risked accusation. Write about forbidden love, and someone might assume it's personal. Praise a foreign land too lovingly, and you could be seen as ungrateful, or worse, a spy. So women invented double meanings. They used classical references, botanical symbols, astrological codes. A tulip might mean passion, a nightingale might mean longing, a moth circling a flame, desire, madness, or death. Your choice. One poem tucked into the pages of a Quran found decades later reads, "They say I am quiet, but my ink stains the pillows, and if you follow the music, you'll find my rebellion hidden in every note." A scholar's debate that still lingers. Did the palace allow this creativity as a form of control, or did it overlook it because the women masked it so well? Some historians argue that encouraging music and poetry created the illusion of freedom. Others believe the harem women earned their space for expression through sheer skill. It's possible both are true. The empire was practical. It wouldn't silence beauty if it could be useful, and the women knew how to make it very useful. Occasionally, music left the harem. During major ceremonies, the most talented performers were allowed to play before the Sultan's court, behind a screen, of course. Their voices would float out over rows of viziers and foreign guests. No one could see them, but everyone listened. Some ambassadors wrote about these moments in awed tones, claiming they'd never heard such melancholy, such clarity. What they didn't realise? The women were singing about themselves. You pass now into a quiet hall, where an old ney flute rests on a velvet pillow. It's cracked, no longer played, but beneath it is a small scroll sealed with faded wax. Someone once left a song here. Maybe it was never performed, or maybe it was played once, then buried. The chorus reads, "I belong to no king. The stars guide me, not guards. Even the moon must bow when a woman sings her name. Tonight, as the harem sleeps and the palace echoes only with wind, one girl stays awake, ink-stained fingers hovering over paper. She writes quickly, heart thudding. Not for fame, not for freedom, but for something no punishment can take. Her story, in her own words." Next, we descend into mysticism and memory. The spells, omens, and secret rituals whispered through generations of palace women. The lamps are low, the corridors emptied of footsteps, and the night presses in like a hush made of velvet. This is when the air in the harem shifts. When silk doesn't rustle, it slithers. When prayer beads are clutched not just for devotion, but for protection. You're stepping into a part of harem life that even the most detailed palace records barely whisper about. The unseen world. Tonight, we leave logic at the threshold and enter a realm of spells, talismans, curses, dreams, and a kind of magic stitched not with wands or wizards, but with saffron ink and rosewater. Because yes, magic was real here. Maybe not in the flashy, wand-waving, lightning bolt sense, but in the deep, human way. These women lived in confinement, surrounded by suspicion, trapped in a web of politics, rivalry, and fate. So they reach for something older, something outside the rules, and whether it worked or not, that's not the point. The belief worked. The rituals gave them power when nothing else did. Let's begin with the basics. Talismans. Nearly every woman in the harem wore one, though few admitted it openly. Small, often hidden, worn around the neck, sewn into hems, braided into hair. Some were simple, a scrap of parchment inscribed with a Quranic verse in looping Arabic calligraphy. Others were elaborate, tiny scrolls tucked into silver lockets, blessed by a palace imam or whispered over by an elderly servant who knew things. These charms served every purpose: protection from rivals, safety in childbirth, favour in the eyes of the Sultan, even help in conceiving a son. Fringe fact, the harem had its own hidden network of wise women, not exactly witches, not exactly clerics, often older concubines or bathhouse attendants who had learned the old ways. They mixed herbs, read dreams, and carried remedies in their sleeves. Need to curse someone's luck without drawing attention? They had a powder for that. Need to charm your voice before a music performance? They'd murmur a prayer into rosewater and tell you to sip it under moonlight. No receipts, just results. Dreams were currency too, not just gossip fodder but prophecy. It was believed that the soul roamed while the body slept, visiting realms seen only by the dead and the truly gifted. If a concubine dreamt of birds flying backward, or a mirror cracking in slow motion, she'd rush to the nearest dream interpreter before dawn. Some dreams meant fortune, others warned of betrayal, and a few meant someone in the palace was going to die. There's a recorded incident from the early 1700s. A concubine dreamt that her chamber floor opened like a mouth and swallowed her mirror whole. The next day, the chief black eunuch fell ill. Within a week he was dead. Coincidence? Maybe. But she was promoted not long after. Some said she'd had nothing to do with the death. Others said she'd known exactly what she was doing when she crushed the beetle and burned its shell in oil the night before. You walk now into the bathhouse, not for bathing, but for ritual. The steam has long since thinned, but in the quiet corners of the marble chamber you find traces. A smear of blue chalk near the door, a dried cluster of lavender tied with a black thread tucked behind a column. Someone's been here. Someone's doing something. Water itself held power. The palace used holy water from Mecca for official ceremonies, but the women had their own supplies, wells blessed during new moons, or snow melted in silence, then whispered over. Some kept bowls beside their beds to trap bad dreams. Others washed their hands with scented water before speaking to the Sultan, believing it would clean their words of fear. The harem was steeped in superstition, and architecture played its part. Certain rooms were avoided, not because of politics, but because someone had died there under mysterious circumstances. Candles flickered too often. Mirrors cracked without reason. One chamber was permanently closed after 3 concubines who lived there suffered sudden illness within months. Sinan may have designed the harem with logic, but the women lived in patterns, and patterns meant warnings. Some rituals were collective. On the eve of important festivals, the women gathered, not for worship but for warding. They passed around bundles of herbs, burned incense, and whispered blessings over trays of sweets. Superstitious, yes, but comforting. And when comfort is rationed, ritual becomes religion. Scholars still argue over how seriously the palace took these beliefs. Some claim the empire officially dismissed such practices as foolishness. Others note that even high-ranking viziers carried talismans into battle, and the Valide Sultan herself was once said to have commissioned a charm from a Sufi mystic to protect her son. What does that tell you? That in a place ruled by structure, ritual gave women a way to bend the rules. It wasn't rebellion, not openly, but it was a way to say, I still have power, even if it's made of fig leaves and silver thread. One story, whispered rather than written, tells of a concubine who cursed her rival with silence. She mixed ashes with honey and smeared it on the woman's pillow. The next day, her rival lost her voice. For 3 weeks she couldn't speak. No music, no poetry, no seduction. By the time she healed, the Sultan's interest had passed. Was it magic, science, stress? No one cared. The power had shifted. You pause in a corridor where a wind chime made of carved bone hangs from the ceiling. It moves with no breeze, just the weight of memory. As the harem sleeps somewhere in the lowest chamber, a woman lights a candle and presses a dried poppy into her palm. She murmurs 3 names, not of allies, not of enemies, but of possibilities. Tomorrow, one of those names might rise. Next, we turn our eyes westward. How European travellers, artists and spies distorted or discovered the truths hiding in the harem's shadow. Europe couldn't stop looking. The Ottoman harem, cloistered, opulent, whisper-wrapped, was everything the West wanted it to be. Exotic, erotic, and just out of reach. For centuries, travellers, diplomats, painters, and professional busybodies craned their necks toward the domes of Topkapi, trying to guess what lay behind the gilded gates. And when they couldn't see it, they invented it. Tonight, we follow the Venetian mirrors, the quills of French letter-writers, the oil-soaked brushes of curious artists, and the spies who all tried, some earnestly, some salaciously, to decode the mystery of the harem. Let's begin in the 16th century, when the Ottoman Empire was Europe's favourite fear. The West viewed the Turks as both monstrous and magnificent, bloodthirsty on the battlefield, but masters of elegance and power. The harem was their forbidden inner sanctum, rumoured to house hundreds of women draped in silk and submissiveness, waiting in shadowed splendour for the Sultan's pleasure. Of course, no one could confirm that. So, naturally they guessed, wildly. Some of the earliest descriptions of the harem came from men who had never set foot within it. Venetian and French diplomats, locked out of the women's quarters, wrote lurid second-hand accounts based on conversations with disgruntled eunuchs, or half-translated gossip from palace staff. They painted the harem as a golden prison of idleness and indulgence. According to one ambassador's account, the Sultan, bathed in honey, was fanned by 20 virgins and took a different woman to bed each hour. That's not a description, it's fan fiction with a fancy wax seal. But people believed it, or wanted to. The West had its own gender tensions, its own curiosity about power and desire, and the idea of a ruler surrounded by hundreds of mysterious women. That was a canvas for every suppressed fantasy. Fringe fact: in the 18th century, a Frenchman named Baron de Tott, an actual military advisor to the Ottomans, claimed he'd caught a glimpse of the harem through a half-open door. He described swan-like women and odours of cinnamon and musk, and concluded that the women were well versed in the art of gazing without speaking. That's poetic and completely unverifiable. But not all observers were fabricators. Some tried to tell the truth, especially women. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, the wife of the British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in the early 1700s, was one of the few Western women granted access to female-only spaces in Istanbul. Her letters are famous, not just for their wit, but for their clarity. She visited Turkish bathhouses, interacted with local women, and marvelled at their freedom within the private sphere. "I found the Turkish ladies not only well-informed," she wrote, "but far less confined than our own sex in England." She was shocked by their autonomy, their financial independence, their sharp opinions, and while she never saw the inner harem of Topkapi, her observations offered something rare: respect. Still, Lady Mary's words didn't carry the same weight as male writers. Her letters were published posthumously, and even then many readers dismissed them as fanciful or exaggerated. Ironic, considering she was being less dramatic than her male counterparts. That's the game, isn't it? Meanwhile, artists in Europe fed the flames. The orientalist painting craze of the 18th and 19th centuries turned imagined harems into a genre of their own. Jean-Léon Gérôme, Ingres, Delacroix, all painted variations of the same fantasy. Half-dressed women lounging like tame tigers, menacing eunuchs lurking nearby, and architecture that looked more like a bazaar than a palace. These paintings were soaked in eroticism but completely detached from cultural truth. They weren't windows, they were mirrors reflecting European fantasies back at themselves. But it wasn't just artists and writers. Spies, real ones, also turned their attention to the harem. European courts wanted to understand how the Ottomans maintained such centralised control, and the harem, they believed, was key. Some agents tried to bribe eunuchs for information, others used female contacts, usually mistresses or foreign wives with palace access. Their reports were filled with guesswork and paranoia, often mistaking personal dramas for political strategy. One English agent once claimed that the Valide Sultan was secretly ruling the empire through coded embroidery passed to the Sultan in the form of handkerchiefs. A little far-fetched, absolutely, but also weirdly plausible. And that was the problem. The harem wasn't completely innocent, nor was it the carnal theme park Europe made it out to be. It was a system, a political structure, a cultural artifact. But once Western audiences got a taste of it, imagined or not, they couldn't let go. Even now, the word harem conjures fantasy faster than fact. You walk now into a small gallery space tucked in a quiet wing of Topkapi. On display, European renderings of the harem from the 1700s, women in gauzy silks, rooms overflowing with pillows and hookahs. Not a single image includes a book, or a tutor, or a political document. No music rehearsals, no prayers, just soft bodies in soft light. This is the legacy of misseeing. A few modern scholars have tried to correct the record. They've translated palace documents, studied architectural plans, and examined the economic impact of harem-run endowments. But even so, the fantasy lingers. Because fantasy sells, truth takes longer, and sometimes the line between observer and distorter is thin. Even today, tourists peer through the gates of Topkapi's harem rooms with the same hungry eyes, trying to feel what they imagine happened there. They're standing in a library and picturing lingerie. They're seeing a lesson hall and thinking of belly dancing. They're asking how many wives the Sultan had, not how many women governed provinces through their sons. And maybe the biggest irony of all? While European men were painting nudes and guessing wildly, the real women of the harem were writing poems, composing music, managing estates, and navigating power like seasoned diplomats. It's the oldest trick in the book. Underestimate a woman, and she'll use it. As you leave the gallery and step back into the courtyard, the sun catches on the latticework above. Light filters through like fragments of memory. You wonder how many more stories have been misread, how many truths are still wrapped in myth. Next, we step into the cracks, those moments when the women decided they'd had enough, and rebellion rose like smoke from behind the curtain. It starts as a whisper, quiet enough to be mistaken for the rustle of silk, the crackle of a brazier, the hush of slippers across marble. But it spreads like fire through dry reeds. A favourite is stripped of her privileges. A beloved tutor is dismissed without reason. The kitchen shortens rations, the music lessons are cancelled, the eunuchs walk a little too fast, and then someone disappears. That's when the harem knows. Something's wrong. Tonight you witness the rarest of events. A rebellion not from outside the palace walls, but from within the harem itself. You wouldn't think these women could rebel. After all, what can you really do when you're locked behind walls, watched by guards, and technically have no legal identity? But the harem wasn't just an institution of obedience. It was a furnace of pressure, and when you compress enough ambition, betrayal and fear into a single space for long enough, things break. The rebellion doesn't always look like fire and blood. Sometimes it's silent, surgical. Sometimes it's a full-fledged uprising. Let's rewind to the late 17th century, specifically the reign of Sultan Mehmed IV. His mother, Turhan Sultan, held immense power as Valide Sultan. She was strategic, sharp, and deeply unpopular among certain factions within the harem. She was known for cutting favours, removing rivals, and stacking the harem hierarchy with her loyalists. At first, the women grumbled. Then they plotted. The rebellion began in the bathhouse. Fringe fact: the bathhouse was the only place in the harem where women gathered without guards, without eunuchs hovering at every corner. It was humid, loud, and full of steam. Not just ideal for gossip, but for conspiracy. A group of senior Cadins began coordinating. They left each other marks in coal on the backs of mirrors. They scratched coded messages into soap cakes. They pretended to slip on wet tiles just to whisper in ears. Their goal wasn't to kill anyone, it was to destabilise Turhan Sultan's control, and they knew exactly how to do it. Interrupt the flow of information. Every decision in the palace required communication between the harem and the outer court. So the women slowed it. They bribed or pressured loyal eunuchs to delay messages. They rewrote letters. They intercepted scrolls. One eunuch was found unconscious in the corridor, slipped a sedative in his tea. By the time Turhan Sultan noticed something was wrong, her decisions were being overturned, her orders reversed. Chaos. Eventually, the chief black eunuch intervened. Punishments were swift. 5 women were reassigned to distant palaces, 2 were forcibly married off to elderly bureaucrats as rewards, and 1, an ambitious concubine named Nasira, was found dead in her chamber, the cause listed as fever. No one believed it, but Turhan's grip was never the same again. The rebellion didn't succeed in toppling her, but it carved out space for resistance. The harem had shown its teeth. Another uprising came decades later, during the short, scandal-soaked reign of Sultan Ibrahim I, better known in palace lore as Ibrahim the Mad. His erratic behaviour shook the harem to its core. He lavished wealth on absurd things, like lining entire rooms with sable fur, and played favourites with reckless abandon. He became obsessed with one concubine and ordered all others removed. When the Valide Sultan objected, he had her locked in her chambers for days. The women didn't just sit quietly, they stopped singing, they stopped dressing up, they refused to appear at ceremonies, a mass sit-in of silk and silence. It wasn't a violent rebellion, but it was visible, public, humiliating, and it rattled the outer court. When the Grand Vizier visited the palace and found the harem eerily quiet, he knew something had to give. Days later, Ibrahim's excesses were officially cited as dangerous. He was deposed. His concubines, those who remained, went back to smiling, but only after a statement had been made. Rebellion didn't always come from collectives. Sometimes a single woman took a risk so bold it shook the palace. One famous case involved a concubine named Aten, who was accused of spying for a faction of janissaries. Whether or not it was true, her actions after the accusation became legend. Facing demotion, she locked herself in her chamber and wrote a manifesto, yes, an actual document, accusing the Valide Sultan of corruption, favoritism, and cruelty. She bribed a eunuch to deliver it to a visiting religious scholar in the outer court. By the time it reached the Sultan, half the palace had read it. Aten disappeared, of course. But so did two high-ranking officials named in the letter. Funny how that works. You pass now through the narrow corridor leading to the Altan cafes, the Golden Cage. It was once used to confine rebellious princes, but during moments of unrest, women were held here too. The walls still whisper with tension. One tile bears a faint crack. Legend says it happened when a woman threw an inkpot at her guard. She missed, but the message landed. A recurring scholarly debate surrounds these rebellions. Were they rare sparks, or signs of deeper unrest the Empire just refused to document? Some say the few recorded events are just the tip of the iceberg, that most uprisings were buried in euphemisms, transfer, illness, reassignment. Others argue the harem was more stable than we think, and these moments were dramatic exceptions. But anyone who's walked these halls, who's seen the way the windows face inward and the doors only open one way, knows the truth. This place wasn't just silk and ceremony. It was pressure, waiting to explode. And when it did, it wasn't with fire or swords. It was with silence, strategy, and just enough rage to shake marble. As dusk falls over Topkapi once again, the garden below is calm. But somewhere, a woman is quietly packing. Not to escape, not yet, but to move, to pivot. Because today, the harem has changed, and tomorrow, the game resumes. Next, we watch the slow unravelling. How time, reform and revolution pulled the thread that finally loosened the harem's grip on empire. Nothing in the Ottoman Empire crumbled overnight. Not the palaces, not the power, and certainly not the harem. What brought it down wasn't fire or fury. It was time. Quiet, patient, insistent time. A thread pulled here, a reform there, a new idea floated on a European breeze, and suddenly, the thing that once seemed eternal began to fray. Tonight, we watch the unravelling. Not a dramatic collapse, but the slow, elegant decay of the institution that once held the heart of the empire in its silken fist. By the 19th century, the Ottoman world was changing fast. Borders were shifting, wars were draining the treasury. European influence, once resisted, now grudgingly tolerated, was seeping in through diplomacy, trade, and culture. The empire's leadership was beginning to flirt with westernization, especially during the Tanzimat period, a sweeping series of reforms that aimed to modernize law, education, military and civil administration. And you know what doesn't fit neatly into a modernized, constitutionally inclined pseudo-European government? A massive palace wing full of royal concubines and eunuchs. But you can't just snap your fingers and dissolve a centuries-old tradition. So the changes came slowly, subtly. First, there was the trimming of staff. Fewer girls were brought into the palace. Recruitment methods, once involving tribute, captivity, or targeted selection, became less frequent, then less formal. Some provinces stopped sending girls altogether, preferring to educate them locally or marry them into military families. The harem, once swelling with hundreds of women, began to shrink. The eunuch hierarchy shifted too. With the weakening of the Janissary corps and the growing influence of bureaucrats trained in European law, the chief black eunuch's role lost its teeth. He was no longer a gatekeeper to empire, just an administrator with too many rooms and not enough power to keep them full. Fringe fact, in the mid-1800s, Sultan Abdülmecid, who commissioned the Grand Dolmabahce Palace, relocated the Imperial harem from Topkapi to the new, Western-style building on the Bosphorus. Unlike the labyrinthine, shadowy harem of old, Dolmabahce's harem featured wide windows, mirrored ballrooms, and chandeliers the size of fishing boats. It was less secretive, more decorative. Beautiful, yes. But the mystery had faded. The women walked sunlight corridors now. They could see the ships, and the ships could see them. Not everyone embraced the change. Older members of the harem viewed these reforms with deep suspicion. They remembered a time when power was quiet, deliberate, folded into every layer of fabric and etiquette. Now, young women read novels translated from French. They debated politics in the gardens. Some had tutors from Europe who taught them philosophy and, scandalously, mathematics. The old guard clutched their talismans tighter. They whispered about the days when a well-placed poem could bring down a vizier. Now, you were lucky to get an audience with the Sultan at all. Because the Sultans had changed too. As the imperial role weakened under constitutional pressures, the Sultan's time and authority became increasingly ceremonial. He was still the caliph, technically, but many decisions were now made by parliament and reformist ministers. The harem's influence on policy, once so potent, was fading. Valide sultans rarely held the kind of authority their predecessors enjoyed. The harem was still present, still maintained, but it was no longer the invisible heart of the empire. One scholar wrote, "The harem became a photograph of itself, still dressed, still smiling, but already history." Yet even in decline, the harem adapted. Some women saw the writing on the wall and reinvented themselves. Instead of relying on charm or lineage, they turned to education. Many learned to write in both Arabic and the Latin-based Turkish script. They read newspapers. They followed the debates about modernization, and some even engaged with early feminist thought. They weren't just aware of the world beyond the walls, they were preparing to live in it. One notable example was Nasife Hanım, a high-ranking harem woman during the reign of Sultan Abdulaziz. When the court fell into political turmoil and her own future became uncertain, she negotiated her own exit. She requested an annuity, housing in a less scrutinized district, and access to books from the palace library. Her request was granted. Within a year, she was living in modest comfort, exchanging letters with French intellectuals. A former concubine turned amateur scholar. That's one way to retire. Still, the reforms didn't protect everyone. As the empire teetered toward collapse in the early 20th century, the palace itself became a burden. The royal household, harem included, was seen by reformers and revolutionaries as an expensive relic. During the Young Turk movement and later under Ataturk's republic, royal privileges were dismantled, titles stripped, lands seized, the caliphate abolished, and with it, the harem system died. Not in one night, but over a few brutal years. When the imperial family was exiled in 1924, the harem women were left behind, some in Istanbul, some scattered, some quietly dismissed without ceremony or protection. A few found shelter with wealthy families, others faded into poverty, their palace silks traded for anonymity. They weren't villains, they weren't symbols. They were women caught in a tidal shift, standing on marble floors while the sea changed direction. The last official resident of the imperial harem, Fatma Pesend Hanım, died in 1924. She was said to have lived her final days in quiet reflection, still dressing as if palace life hadn't ended. She refused to speak against the new republic, but she never spoke about her past either. Today, what's left of the harem exist in fragments. Some rooms remain preserved at Topkapi, roped off and museum-labelled. A few memoirs survive, most of them cautious, censored, half-lit by fear or nostalgia, and the rest? Still hiding in shadow, still waiting to be remembered properly. As you stand in the doorway of what was once the Sultan's private chamber, the light hits the walls in just the right way, and you swear you hear laughter, sharp, knowing, feminine, not haunting, just waiting. Next, we descend from history into memory, what it means to carry the stories of these women forward in a world that almost forgot them. You've walked the golden corridors, heard the music behind the walls, touched the hem of silk stitched with secrets. Now all that's left is the afterglow, the echo of footsteps in an empty palace, the ghost of perfume in a locked drawer. The harem may be gone, but its memory lingers like a half-finished song. Tonight, we follow those echoes into the present, into the struggle to remember and misremember, to romanticize and reclaim, to honour and, let's be honest, sometimes still completely misrepresent what this place was. This isn't just history anymore, this is legacy. First, let's talk about what memory does. It simplifies, compresses, turns real, breathing lives into metaphors and museum labels. A concubine becomes a symbol, a Valide Sultan becomes a cautionary tale. But memory also preserves in ways that surprise you, in oral stories passed down through generations, in an old woman's bedtime tales to her granddaughter about the time her own grandmother worked in the palace laundry, in whispered family secrets. Your great-aunt was a tutor in the Sultan's harem, but we don't talk about that. Except they do, in corners, over tea, when no one official is listening. When the Republic of Turkey was founded in 1923, there was a hard pivot away from the imperial past. The new government wanted modernity, science, progress, not harems, turbans, or sultanic poetry. Topkapi Palace became a museum. The harem was open to the public, partially. But with the velvet ropes and guided tours came a kind of sanitized remembering. A few polished chambers, a plaque here, a mannequin there, the complex power games, the female networks, the quiet rebellions, mostly omitted. Too complicated, too uncomfortable, too powerful maybe. Even today, harem memory walks a strange line. On one side, you have historians carefully digging through archives, translating endowment records and personal letters, trying to reconstruct who these women really were. On the other side, you have pop culture, TV dramas, costume-heavy soap operas, soft-focused documentaries with narrators who sound like they're describing a spa resort. The facts and the fantasy continue their old tug-of-war. And guess which one gets better ratings? Fringe fact. One of the most watched Turkish television shows of the last decade was Muhteşem Yüzyıl, The Magnificent Century, a lavish drama centered around Harem Sultan's rise to power in the court of Süleyman the Magnificent. It reignited public interest in the harem, especially among young women, and sparked fierce debates. Was it accurate? Absolutely not. Was it empowering? Sometimes. Was it fascinating? Always. But for all its historical liberties, the show did something vital. It reminded people that these women weren't background decoration. They were players. They loved, schemed, grieved, rose, fell, and that matters more than a perfect timeline ever could. Meanwhile, scholars continue to argue over how to frame the harem. Was it oppressive or empowering, a prison or a palace of possibility? The answer, of course, is both, and neither. It depended on who you were when you were born, how clever you were, who you crossed paths with, and how you navigated the shifting currents of imperial politics. Some women found freedom in this gilded cage, others were crushed by it. Some ruled nations, some vanished without a trace. You walk through modern Istanbul now, and traces of the harem peek through in unexpected places. In mosques commissioned by royal women, in the names of neighbourhoods, in museums where their jewellery, reclaimed from private collections, sparkles under LED lights, in libraries where their poetry, once buried in forgotten manuscripts, is finally being published under their real names. Not Odalisk number 3. Butchehsuvar, Dilruba, Zeynep. Their stories are finding light again. In universities, young scholars, many of them women, are rewriting what we thought we knew. They're digging past orientalist fantasy and nationalist erasure, reading court records alongside folk songs, treating the harem not as a sideshow, but as central to Ottoman history. They're asking harder questions. How did women exercise power within limitations? What did it mean to love or lose in a world built on hierarchy and silence? And what can modern societies learn from a space where women were both the ruled and the rulers? Some critics argue that remembering the harem too fondly risks glorifying a patriarchal system. Others insist that forgetting it altogether erases centuries of female agency, and somewhere in the middle are those who just want the full story, not the cleaned-up tour version, not the fantasy painting, but the real thing in all its contradictions. Because that's what legacy really is. Not just what you leave behind, but how people carry it forward. In Istanbul, there's a growing movement to re-examine the contributions of imperial women. Mosques once attributed solely to their husbands are now being restored with plaques that finally name the female patrons. Endowment deeds that funded schools, hospitals and kitchens are being translated and digitized. Even the harem quarters at Topkapi are being reconsidered, not as an exotic corner of the past, but as a space of lived experience, shaped by and for women navigating an impossible system. And in households across Turkey, old stories still slip through. A mother tells her daughter, "You should have seen how clever Harem was." A grandmother says, "Your great-great was a laundress for the Valide Sultan, and she knew everything." The official histories may falter, but the personal ones persist. You stop for tea at a small cafe not far from the old palace walls. A girl at the next table is studying for an exam, books open, highlighter in hand. You glance at her notes. One name jumps out, Haseki Sultan. Still being studied, still being debated, still here. As the call to prayer echoes faintly across the rooftops, you realise something. The harem may have vanished as an institution, but its memory is very much alive. And like all powerful memories, it refuses to stay neatly shelved. Next, we return one last time to the beginning, to a single woman newly arrived standing at the threshold of this strange seductive world with everything ahead of her. The gates are shut behind you with a final padded thud. No clang, no ceremony, just the soft slide of wood into iron and a silence that settles like a second skin. You're back at the start now, or maybe it's the end. A girl just arrived. 17, maybe 16. Her hands tremble slightly beneath the gauze of her sleeves. She stepped off the boat only hours ago, barefoot on Istanbul stone, blinking against the light that spilled from the domes of Topkapi. Now she's here, in the harem. She has no idea what she's stepping into. They've taken her name already. Not officially, not yet, but it's slipping. In its place, something new is coming, softer, more musical. They'll name her after a flower or a virtue or the moon. Something that rolls off the tongue with just enough elegance to sound royal. Her old name? That belonged to someone who was allowed to look men in the eye. Someone who belonged to a different rhythm, a different roof. Now she belongs to the harem. At first it's overwhelming. The marble shines too brightly. The corridors twist with intention. Every woman she sees seems to walk like she's already been here 100 years. They smile with closed mouths. Their glances feel like tests she didn't study for. No one tells her where to go. She's nudged, positioned, arranged like part of the furniture, but she learns quickly. Everyone does. The harem doesn't tolerate slow learners. Her first lesson? Observation. She watches the way a nod travels between the older girls. She notices that the girl who speaks French gets better fabric for her gowns, that the kitchen girl with the almond-shaped eyes is always in the right place at the right time, that the Valide Sultan never walks, she glides, and when she speaks it's never louder than a whisper. She notices all of it. She's given a room the size of a prayer mat, a comb made of the horn, and a bowl of lentils. That night she cries so quietly that even the girl on the other side of the wall doesn't hear. But she doesn't cry the next night, or the one after that. She is transforming, cell by cell. She learns the prayer schedule, the shifts of the baths, the way not to look too eager when the chief eunuch passes. She learns how to eat delicately, how to pour tea without a sound, how to walk without her slippers making noise on the marble. She learns what a tilt of the head means, what perfumes are for what mood, and that the word sister doesn't mean what she thought it meant. Then come the lessons. Music first. The canon hurts her fingers, but she learns to fake her way through most scales. Her Turkish improves. Then comes poetry. A tutor recites verses by Fuzuli with the solemnity of a death sentence. She copies them down. She memorizes lines she doesn't understand yet, but she will. And then, one day, she's summoned. Not to the Sultan. That takes time, and timing. No, this is a simple request. She's been chosen to attend a banquet. Not perform, not speak, just appear. Sit, smile, be noticed. It's the first moment she realizes she's no longer invisible. Her gown is silk. Her hair is oiled and braided. Her lips are painted the faint red of a pomegranate split just enough to tempt. When she steps into the outer chamber, the others glance sideways. She's being watched now. She's in the game. Does she want to be noticed? That's the question no one dares ask. In the harem, being invisible is safe. Being seen is dangerous and addictive. She's noticed, of course. The Sultan's eyes rest on her a moment longer than they should. Favourite frowns. A eunuch smirks. Something shifts. From now on, she walks more carefully. There's a fringe tradition in the harem that few talk about. Before a concubine is summoned to the Sultan's chamber for the first time, one of the older women gives her a mirror. It's symbolic. Not of beauty, but of knowledge, of reflection. See yourself now, they say, because after tonight, you won't be who you were. She doesn't understand what that means yet. She will. Soon, the summons comes. Not dramatically, just a folded message placed on her tray. Her hands shake again, but she doesn't cry this time. She prepares. She scrubs her skin until it glows. She's dressed in lavender silk. She's taught a phrase to say when she enters the chamber. She's told not to speak otherwise, and she doesn't. She waits. The door opens. She steps in. What happens next? That's her secret. That's all their secret. But afterward, she's moved. Her room is larger. Her meals are warmer. The other women speak to her differently. She's no longer just another girl in waiting. She's someone, a potential, a player, and maybe, just maybe, she's pregnant. The signs are subtle. She sleeps more. The eunuchs bring her strange teas. The Valide sends for her. She's examined, questioned gently. Then, one day, a quiet celebration. No drums, no fireworks, but she's escorted to a new chamber. She's now Haseki Sultan, consort. And if the child is a boy, everything changes again. But in the space between being summoned and giving birth, she realizes something. She's not afraid anymore. She knows this place. She knows its games. She can hear the lies behind the compliments. She can read the body language of a nod at breakfast. She knows when something is brewing and when to disappear for a few days. She's not a flower. She's a root, deep and quiet. History might not remember her name, but she's writing it down in ink mixed with saffron and prayer. Tucked behind a tile, folded into her linens. Somewhere, someone will read it. Because every powerful woman in the harem began like this. A girl who watched, who learned, who understood that survival wasn't about obedience, it was about timing. Tomorrow we finish the story. Not with a coronation or a death, but with a candle going out, and the silence that comes when all the doors have finally closed. It ends the way it always does. Not with shouting, not with fire, but with a soft final exhale. The palace quiets. The eunuchs fold away their robes. The bells in the corridors fall still. The once glowing courtyards grow pale with dust. And somewhere, in a shadowed upper chamber tucked behind a latticed window, a woman breathes her last. She isn't a queen, not officially, not anymore. But she was something once. A name spoken carefully, a power whispered between velvet folds. Now, she's a memory. One last breath in the long story of the harem. No one comes to announce her death. That's not how things are done. The news travels slowly, deliberately, from servant to eunuch to steward. A candle is snuffed out in the hallway leading to her old chamber. That's the signal. It means, quietly, someone important is no longer with us. She lived long enough to see the empire she once helped steer dissolve into borders, constitutions and marble that no longer listens. Her jewellery sits in a museum now. Her endowments are footnotes. The girls she mentored are scattered or gone, their names faded into Ottoman cursive on brittle paper. She outlived her sultan, outlived her son, outlived the palace itself in a way. And still, no one writes her story quite right. You sit now where her chamber once stood, or still stands, depending on which map you believe. The tiles are cracked, the ceiling's soot dark, but the bones of it are here. The mirrored closet, the niche for incense, the scorched mark on the sill from a candle left burning too long. She might have written poems here, might have plotted marriages or prayers or revenge. We'll never know. But that's the harem's final cruelty. So many women, so few names that survived. Fringe fact. When the harem was finally dismantled, most of the remaining women weren't imprisoned or exiled. They were simply dismissed. Some were given small pensions, a few married off to minor bureaucrats, others found themselves in unfamiliar Istanbul neighbourhoods, scraping by on old silk and faint prestige. A few adapted, many faded. The archives list them under new names: Fatma, Layla, Zainab, with no titles, no rank. One day you're a Haseki, The next, just another widow with a sewing needle. Some might call that tragedy. Others would say it's liberation, but history rarely checks in with women after the curtain falls. Scholars argue over what exactly the harem meant. Some say it was a gilded prison, a symptom of empire's obsession with control. Others insist it was a sanctuary of female power, a place where women, in absence of freedom, forged influence. The truth, like always, is in the middle. The harem was not a single thing. It was 100 rooms, 1,000 women, millions of choices made in silence and silk. Some triumphed, some survived, some simply endured. And their legacy? It's hidden in places you wouldn't expect. It's in the mosque still standing with endowments signed by women whose signatures were once dismissed. It's in the music composed behind veils, still performed in Istanbul's conservatories. It's in the old folk tales about clever concubines who outwitted sultans with riddles and dreams. It's in modern Turkish novels, where the harem isn't always a prison, but sometimes, just sometimes, a stage. You walk the palace one last time. The fountain in the courtyard no longer bubbles. The door to the sultan's chamber is sealed. The golden road is empty. But your footsteps echo in a space that refuses to die. The air still smells faintly of rosewater and ambition. The ghosts here are not mournful. They are observant. They watch. They wait. They remember. One final image, a scrap of fabric, folded and hidden beneath a floorboard, discovered decades later during a quiet renovation. It was embroidered, not with flowers or gold, but with a single line of poetry. They caged me in marble, but I bent the light. Who wrote it? No one knows. Maybe a girl who came and went. Maybe someone you followed all along. Maybe a woman whose name was never written down, but who carved herself into this place anyway. Not with rebellion, not with seduction, but with sheer, relentless presence. That's the secret of the harem, the great forbidden truth. It was never just about desire or duty. It was about women making lives inside a system that never intended them to survive. And not just surviving, but shaping an empire from behind a screen. And now, as you step back into the present, into your own room, your own night, you feel it. That slow, deep knowledge that nothing powerful ever really vanishes.